This is disc number 4.
Sal had kept his temper stoppered all morning, and now the stopper was edging loose. Looking up from the rock he'd just shattered, he tossed his shovel over his shoulder. In Sicily, when a man— "Do I look," Tate demanded, "like I give a damn about Sicily?" Bratchett was shaking his head. For Bratchett's sake, Sal made himself go back to digging. "About this you do not, and this is your loss." Sal heard the crunch of rocky soil as Tate landed beside him in the hole. Spinning around, Sal saw Bratchett leaping to yank Tate backward by his collar. "Slow down a spell, Tate. Think. Shank'll fire you both, and you'll be back to weeding your turnips full time." Tate spat to one side. "Infestation." Bratchett kept one hand on Tate's chest to hold him there. "Now that's a bigger word than I'd have wagered you knew. 4 syllables, even." As 2 other men hauled Tate back, Sal tipped an invisible cap. "A great country this America is." And he meant it. But then he heard himself add, "where the infestation becomes the American. Pretty soon we are all of us the Americans together, yes? The mark of a great country." Shaking off the men who'd gripped his elbows, Tate rounded on Sal. "Listen here, Dago. You think nobody saw how you was talking to Carrie McGregor at the train station? First thing I heard when I come back to town, how you was talking to her like you had some kind of right." Sal shrugged good-naturedly. "She has the liking for the Sicilians, yes?" Tate was in full flight, arms extended, reaching Sal's neck. Bratchett lowered his shoulders and caught Tate at his midsection, laying him flat. At Tate's cry of fury and the thud as he landed, Shank reined his horse in an about-face. "What is this?" Bratchett reached his hand down toward Tate. "Edge of the hole's a bit slippery from yesterday's rain. No reason to worry, Mr. Shank." Red-faced, Tate was livid as he staggered up. He did not look at Sal, but it was clear who his words, low and menacing, were meant for. "There's some that's suspected of murder. There's some got a hell of a reason to worry." As Sal returned to his shovel, he could hear his mother's voice echo in his head, as clearly as when she'd stood the last time, sickled sideways in pain. The air had smelled of the market, the oregano, mint, and rosemary, the almonds and pistachios and pine nuts, the lemons and sun-dried tomatoes. She'd spoken as she'd sunk to the ground. "I beg you, my son, protect our little Nico. You are strong. Your heart is big and good. You must promise me this." Sal shut his eyes at the memory. Here was the chance for him and Nico to make another fresh start in this country together. But even here, he was surrounded again by suspicion. On a list now for the murder at the train station, in addition to Hennessy's in New Orleans. And even here, Sal could be tracked down for that killing of the police chief 4 years ago. The mist on his face, Sal lifted his eyes to the ring of shrouded blue mountains. Maybe this would be a refuge, a haven, the place where he could finally make good on his promise to keep Nico safe. Or it could be the place Sal would finally be caught. The death of the promise, the end of the line. Chapter 14. As Carrie trudged up Patton Avenue to Asheville Center with Tully and Jersey, the riot of fall color that circled the town seemed to be mocking her, a spectacular party she could not join. Like the Cinderella of the twins' spine-splintered storybook, Carrie was not invited. But Cinderella hadn't been worried about 2 younger siblings. She'd only needed to charm herself a prince. The owner of the general store in Best, now Biltmore Junction, had shaken his head. After the panic a couple years back, Time's been hard. Hire you if I could. Shopkeepers all over Asheville told her similar things. Since the recession in '93, try down the street. Did you check? Tully looked up with rounded eyes, her hair springing out of one braid. Carrying a large, lumpy burlap sack slung over one shoulder, she occasionally patted its side, but she didn't volunteer what it held. Tully was 13 and responsible to a fault. She probably deserved to have a small secret or two. Carrie smoothed her sister's hair. You're hungry, Tulls, and you don't want to tell me. Jersey, though, flopped against Carrie's side like he could no longer hold himself up. I could eat a wild boar, only just me. Tully blinked at him. You wouldn't share none with me? Any, Carrie said. Share any. Jersey blew air through a rounded mouth. Well, hell, like a twin ever got a choice about sharing. Carrie drew 2 hard biscuits from the pocket she'd sewn on the underside of her skirt. She handed them to her siblings. Jersey tore into his, then guiltily blinked. What about you? Carrie waved this away. I'm not hungry, sweet boy, which was partially true, but only because her nausea had grown along with the rejections. Maybe you two had better run on back to the farm. I could be a little bit longer. Tully, mulling something over, nibbled at her biscuit. Aunt Rima started her new job in the kitchens. Maybe there's more jobs at Bill. Carrie held up her hand. And they are lucky to have her. How come you don't like even hearing the name Biltmore? I just hear it plenty these days. Carrie stopped there. The twins didn't need to be infected with her resentment, because resentment, she knew, once under the skin, festers and spreads. Bushels of other places who'll hire me. Jersey's face lit with bright expectation. Where are you headed to now? Tully, just 2 minutes older than her twin, could be years more skeptical. Mighty seldom I've seen you look this discouraged. Carrie had just been remembering her classes at Barnard. Miss Hobson's proud smile as she sometimes passed by in those high-ceilinged halls. The world of poetry opened to Carrie, Wordsworth and Spencer and Tennyson, breaking down why a poem soared, its alliterations, its assonance, its rhythms, sometimes its rhymes, the pictures it painted. Pictures, Carrie reminded herself now, of fields and cliffs and copses and glades that so often caused me to ache for my mountains back home. Maybe, she thought, grown-up life was not so much finding your perfect place in the world, but aching for all the faraway places and people you loved, and learning to look at right where you are now, as Rima would say, through a long eyepiece of grateful. Carrie tousled both heads. You let me do the fretting if there's fretting to get done. From her skirt pocket, she plucked the 2 pennies she'd found last night in the cabin when she changed soiled bedding for her father again. All the cash money they had. You all run and buy stick candy. I'll stop in real quick to this department store here. Meet you back on this spot in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. Jersey loped on ahead, penny in hand, but Tully hung back. You still got the worry from the train station awful, and you got us to think of. You commenced to panicky yet? Carrie chucked her sister under the chin. We're McGregors, aren't we? Tully's face slid into a grin. Whistling, she strolled after her brother, which was a good thing, since Carrie was nearly hurling up her breakfast with all that panicky yet, and she'd only had a handful of bleached apples and a bite of a half-rotted potato to start with. Pausing at the threshold of Bon Marché, she scanned the mannequins in their ridiculous poses, the back of a hand to a forehead, 2 arms overhead, both palms parallel with the sky. The mannequin's clothes gleamed with silk in long, flowing folds, the backs of the gowns studded with mother-of-pearl buttons. That silk would shred down to a fringe with one good walk in the woods. In one half of the store hung gowns with wingspans of puffed sleeves and not but a wisp of a waist, like it be a dragonfly wearing the dress. In the other half hung striped waistcoats for not-from-here men who cared more for fashion than for splitting a good cord of wood. One table held tortoiseshell combs and strings of pearls apparently meant to be woven through complex twists of the hair. Each salesgirl looked to Carrie like the Gibson girl model, tight corseted waist and high starched collar and swoops of coiffed hair, little curls around the face. Carrie swept a hand back over her own mane, already falling out of her mother's half-rusted hairpins. The walk from the farm and then through Best was more than 4 miles, in addition to walking all over Asheville today. The mess of her hair was only a symbol of the far worse that actually mattered, of a falling-in roof and a sick father and only 3 hens left, of winter's coming and the harvest of corn and turnips and potatoes counting up too short to be lasting. Her skirt swung stiffly over the marble floors. She could feel the doorman drop his eyes to the dusty brown of her hemline, but she wasn't about to play the role of pathetic local girl, beggar, waif. From across the department store, Carrie heard a male voice, polished, assured, and familiar. One of the gentlemen from the train station, Grant, the shorter one with a thick brown mustache. Building a palace here in a virtual backwater. George's grandfather, the Commodore, would have positively keeled over. Whatever his taller, frowning companion Cabot said, Carrie could not hear, nor did she care. That they'd apparently chosen to come here or tagged along with the women in Vanderbilt's party was no surprise. Asheville was a small town, and Bon Marché was the only department store around that even hoped to meet a New Yorker's standards. Still, it was poor timing. She'd intended to sweep well past the 2 men before they could recognize her, but in stepping out of her way, John Cabot backed against a rack of ladies' hats, feathered and bowed and bright-colored. He sent it toppling, feathers catching the air on the way down as if the hats had taken flight. Madison Grant reached to set the rack upright as he craned his head to address someone behind him. Our friend Cabot, infamous for his brutality in other spheres, now turns his force on innocent, unarmed hats. The remark may have been meant to be only teasing, but Cabot took Grant's measure a moment, then kept his voice low. How ironic for you to speak of the innocent and the unarmed. Trapped between them, Carrie pretended to consider the hats. C'est n'importe quoi. A young woman inspecting an evening gown tilted her head. Really, Mr. Grant, if you're trying to convince us Mr. Cabot here is a man to be feared for bouts of violence, I'm not yet persuaded. Another young woman, though, turning from a rack of white evening gloves, sounded enthralled. But there have been several deaths, haven't there been? In the game of football, I mean. It sounds rather barbaric. Precisely its appeal. Grant winked at her, unless one happens to be on the receiving end of John Cabot's assaults. Cabot's face hardened again to marble. He turned now, his eyes resting on Carrie. An intensity behind those eyes that stopped her breath. A salesman tumbled out from behind a green curtain and hurried to her. Welcome to Bon Marché, and how may I... His voice trailed off as he took in the whole of her. She watched his face register that she, of the falling hair and no hat and no gloves, couldn't possibly have come to purchase something. Clearing his throat, he straightened his cravat. Help you. These last 2 words were only placeholders while he studied her. Carrie kept her voice steady but low. I'm seeking employment. His head jerking right and then left, the salesman appeared to be searching for the owner, Mr. Lipinski, or anyone else to come to his aid. But no one stood nearby except the doorman, who was engrossed with the patterns of the tin ceiling. The clerk pursed and unpursed his lips, the early attempt at a mustache on his upper lip like a caterpillar crawling in place. "We here at Bon Marché extend our concern, to be sure, miss, but we are not in the business of feeding the friendless." "I'm no more friendless," Carrie shot back, "than you." The salesman's eyes traveled over the not entirely clean cuffs of her dress. His tone became chillier still. "Much as Bon Marché appreciates its community, we are not a charitable organization for the good people of the mountains." Anger swelled in her throat. "I'd like to be clear. I inquired about employment, not charity. Forgive me if I observe that you are slightly built, hardly suited for this work." This from a man who, if his soft, doughy hands told any story, had never plowed a field in his life, much less without a mule, or churned butter until his hands oozed red onto the plunger. "You prefer your salesgirls burly? Perhaps I've not made myself clear. It's more that you are too skinny and hungry-looking," was what he did not say, but she could see it there. "Don't look quite the part," he finished. Struggling to rein in her contempt, she strained for what Miss Hobson might say. One could never, after all, go wrong with squared shoulders and a good quote. "So may the outward shows be least themselves. The world is still deceived with ornament." The salesman looked dully back, no recognition sparking there in his eyes. "I see." But he didn't see, of course, didn't recognize the illusion at all. "The Merchant of Venice," a voice said behind them. Carrie and the salesman both turned to find John Cabot there, eyes on her again, his expression unreadable. The salesman turned back, squinting apparently to reconsider the contradiction of Carrie. The clothes that looked as if they had been once rather fine, but had since seen rougher wear. Carrie could feel him studying her features. Pleasing enough, he probably thought, but with the eyes of an infantryman. She turned her back to the cluster of Vanderbilt guests, all of them staring now. Carrie began counting to 10, just as Aunt Rima had taught her to do. "The insides," Rima liked to muse, "is what the good Lord signifies by the heart. Most other folks, though, calculate by the outsides. So if you're wanting to get on in this world, you got to smooth out the packaging some." "Thank you," Carrie said, "for your time." Without looking back, she kept her head high as she walked away. What she did catch, though, was the face of John Cabot, inscrutable as ever, his eyes still on her. "I say," Grant was observing, "our Miss McGregor from the train station appears to be having difficulty finding a job. First the inn, and now here. I wonder how we might assist." He made no attempt to lower his voice, as if he wanted her to hear his concern. Eyes straight ahead, she aimed for the exit, the doorman still studying the patterns of tin. John Cabot must have thought she'd swept beyond earshot of the conversation. "The fact that you remembered her name, Grant," it was the last Carrie overheard, and already far more than she cared to. Just outside the department store doors, she stopped in her tracks, at the sight of Tully nearly in tears, Sheriff Wolfe standing there, fisted hands on his hips. Jersey held his twin sister's hand, and with his other hand clenched at his side, he seemed ready to spring. "Tully?" Carrie sprang forward and stumbled over something in her path on the sidewalk. "Exactly," Wolfe blustered. "Exactly why I told these two they couldn't sell a bunch of god-ugly roots outside the nicest store in town. Folks will trip over the things, sure enough. Ain't the kind of image the owner'd want to project." In a semicircle near the front doors of Bon Marché, Tully and Jersey had arranged rows of ginseng root. The gnarled brown forms lay there like the bodies of so many malformed dolls. Ginseng root had 1,000 uses, and the twins must have hunted and dug for hours for these over the course of days. But Carrie knew how it must look to city folk. Throwing her arms around the twins, she wished she could cover their ears from what the officer was implying, that poor mountain folks trying their best to survive were unpleasant to look at. Unless, Carrie thought angrily, you were like John Cabot and cataloging all this, these humiliations and deprivations of her family, her people, her life, probably for some future book. "We'll carry them some other place," she told Wolf. To the twins, she added, "to sell them, for cash money you'll have earned to help out. How hard you two must have worked." Kissing each twin fiercely on the top of the head, which she had to pull down to reach, Carrie glanced back toward Bon Marché, where John Cabot and Madison Grant stood on the other side of the window, watching. Two ladies joining them now, each with a strand of pearls at their necks that glowed white and perfect and taunting through the glass. "I'm trapped," Carrie wanted to scream. "Trapped taking care of the twins that I love and a father I don't. Trapped in this place with no job and not much left of the farm and no way out. No way at all I can see. And there you stand, staring." Chapter 15. Uneasy all afternoon, since the police had stopped their group outside Bon Marché to ask questions about the murdered reporter, Lily focused now on smiling. She reminded herself there was no going back. What was done was done. If she could only move forward, quit dragging the past behind her like an anchor, quit letting her father's voice stalk her. "There's times a man's got to take things into his own hands, ma chère petite. Otherwise, every damn Geppetto would have me paying a king's ransom so they can lay about on my wharves." Lily shook the voice from her head. Ever since the death at the station, she'd been plagued with nightmares. The reporter loomed over her bed in these dreams, his finger pointing at her. Sometimes he was joined by the little Italian boy from New Orleans, that crippled leg as thick as a tree as he tried to pull it behind him. It was outlandish, really, that she would cross paths again here with the very child she'd seen from her balcony in New Orleans, at the moment, no less, that he'd been maimed. And now, as if that weren't disconcerting enough, she had to see him again in her dreams. She'd not been sleeping well, despite all Battery Park's comforts. She'd even, Emily said, taken to pacing in the wee hours, which Lily waved away each morning over breakfast at Battery Park. "Sleep," she told Emily, "is for those with no imagination for what to do with moonlight." Forcing a small laugh now, she strolled between Cabot and Grant through Biltmore's conservatory. "I find it intriguing that you both would be accusing each other of the crime of—" She paused for dramatic effect. "Remembering a name." She winced at her own use of the word crime. With his crocodile's smile, Grant thrust both hands in his trousers, but Cabot only looked out toward the mountains that swaddled the estate. The visitors followed their host past the last of the conservatory's orchids, up through a walled garden. On his opposite side from Emily lumbered the St. Bernard, Cedric, at his master's heels, as the great beast seemed to be always. "Pauvre petite bête, the mountain woman, I mean. Poor little thing. She may even have overheard the two of you sparring, as if she needed more humiliation in a day." Cabot stiffened, but Grant waved this away. Cabot fears, I believe, that I might tamper with the young woman's affections given the chance. He implies, in fact, that I have rather the reputation of a rake, albeit an aristocratic one. Although I cannot help but ask, why is this young mountain woman a particular concern of his? Lily tried on the role of magnanimity. It was broad-minded of you both to take an interest, however peculiar, in simple mountain folk. Imagine setting up a kind of roadside stand right outside Bon Marché with those two smudge-faced younger versions of her, those hideous roots they actually thought someone might buy. I suppose it captures your eye, Mr. Cabot, for the tragic. He looked at her, but said nothing. Lily's gaze followed George's. She was thinking of him now in more familiar terms, by his given name, at least in her own thoughts. His eyes ranged over the gardens. Even here at the end of autumn, various shades of greens and browns and maroons swirled among the walkways. She lengthened her strides under the blasted skirt. What an artiste your Mr. Olmsted is, to think of building a formal walled garden here in the midst of these mountains. And what a lovely view from down here of the house. We were hoping for just this effect, transitioning from the French Renaissance style of the house down to a formal garden, and from there, pathways through the woods that shift one still farther to the forests of the New World. By spring, the roses should be well established, and well before that, the tulip bulbs we've imported from Holland and the azaleas just there up the bank should be well in bloom. Lily let her arm brush his. Roses and tulips. How I'd like to see that in spring. She looked up, the very picture of guilelessness, into George's face. Then indeed you shall see it, Miss Barthélemy. I very much want to share these mountains with those who appreciate their beauty. She slowed her pace, and he turned, brushing against her. I hope, she said, you count me in that number. The fear that flickered over his face was probably a good sign, mixed as it was with pleasure. She stirred something in him that was not boredom. I wonder, Mr. Vanderbilt, if I might have your permission to explore the inside of your stables before dinner. His features relaxed into a genuine smile. As the house isn't yet officially open, I suspect dinner will be rather a test. We've hired not only a chef whom Hunt recommended from Paris, but also several locals from the mountains here. I expect a few shots to be fired. She laughed with him. Might we be safer then, staying in the stables and missing this first battlefield dinner altogether? Nearing the front entrance of the house, he paused. It is ridiculous I should have 35 bedrooms for my guests alone, and currently be able to offer you only enough space to change for dinner. But with the construction... I say, Grant was approaching, are you really living above the stables? We're all quite comfortable at Battery Park. Lovely views from the verandas. But wasn't it rather preemptive for you to move out of the brick farmhouse and over here where the work is, if you don't mind my saying, far from complete? The question is, now that I'm settled over the stables, whether or not I'll be convinced ever to move into my chambers once they're complete. Lily exchanged a glance with George that said she knew just how he felt. A nice moment of connection that could be built upon. The footman, Moncrief, burst from the front doors balancing, just barely, a platter of flutes. Champagne? He asked, in a low, dignified voice, but a grin cracked through his attempt at aloofness and calm. It's Delbeck, the best that's grown, they say. Take you right off your head, that it will. One side of Vanderbilt's neatly trimmed mustache twitched. He lifted a flute in a toast. To good champagne, then, yes, and to enthusiasm. They toasted with him, lifting their glasses high in the cool mountain air. And to your remarkable Biltmore, Lily offered, a place like none other. To Biltmore. Glasses clinked. Moncrief proffered more flutes. More tinkling glass, more toasting. And behind where they stood, the crunch of footsteps on the macadam drive. Murmured words, too. Lily stepped away from the group to take in the house from near its front door, her head resting nearly on her back as she gazed up. Near one of the stone lions, an older woman whose face was a homely web of wrinkles and whose hair was a striking, unlovely red striped with gray, stood talking with a young mountain woman they'd encountered earlier. Lily Barthélemy wasn't the type of woman who intentionally overheard conversations. Eavesdropping would have been far beneath her. If, however, others chose to bear their lives in her hearing, she refused to trouble herself and stepped discreetly away. Carrie, was that the name Grant and Cabot had been squabbling over, leaned in toward the old woman, who didn't appear to realize anyone else might overhear. "Gone and changed up your mind then, have you, hon? Bless your sweetheart, you've had a time of it. You look rode hard and put up wet." Her back to Lily, this Carrie person was shaking her head. "Daddy won't be leaving the bed, ever. We're out of money. I'm out of choices." "I know, hon, I'm sorry. I won't sell the farm, ever, but the stable area here's bigger than every cabin left on our ridge, every farmhouse in the village, and the dry goods store put together," she sighed, "which tells me Vanderbilt and his people can wait until our 100 acres of overworked soil gives out not even one wagon of sheaves and a handful of twig-skinny carrots." Lily was startled to feel a frisson of compassion for the mountain girl. The red-haired old woman patted the girl's hand with her wrinkled paw. "Hon, you'll be needin' some in-betwixt care for your daddy. You're already pert nigh wore out, that be clear. You count on me to fill in some gaps here. Bet they'll let me slip off now and then for kin who's towing up to the pearly gates. Since I need the twins to lay out of school to take care of him till I take back over at night, I asked if Miss Hobson could round up some books for us. I think they can be disciplined enough to—" She trailed off there, seemed to realize the Biltmore guests had fallen silent. Life magazine couldn't have pictured the contrast better, Lily thought. The rough and ragged, but not wholly unattractive, mountain people standing outside the shimmering sprawl that was Biltmore, surrounded by the mountains where these people had lived, isolated, no doubt, for so many scores of years. It made for a quaint image, and also, perhaps, a disturbing one. The footman, Moncrief, having traded his platter of champagne for a small sterling tray, was approaching at a trot across the gravel, his already red cheeks going brighter as he ran. Mrs. Smythe would not have approved. Even as Lily glanced at that too eager face and the square of paper he held out to her, she felt her insides twist. Some unforeseen crook in her plans to secure George's trust and catapult herself beyond the threat of scandal and a tainted family name. Resting on a sterling saucer, the soiled handmade envelope told her this was from no one she knew, nor was it from someone with whom she'd choose to correspond. Even as the footman stood there with his beagle's face, waiting for her to thank him, she plucked up the letter and felt the steps of Biltmore shift. No return address, a postmark from Asheville. Her name, then care of George Vanderbilt, no, Esquire, Biltmore Estate, North Carolina, was scratched there. its lines only crude, uneven attempts at the English alphabet. Of course, she should have waited to open the letter, especially given that curling of her insides. But curiosity and revulsion had seized her at the same moment, and neither sat well with patience for long. Ripping the envelope open, she found only a card, soiled, with only a handful of words scrawled in the same stiff, jerking hand. "We got to talk. Soon." Lily let out a gasp before she could stifle it. That he would risk communicating with her like this, linking her name. Merde, the reckless fool. Emily turned toward her from a few feet away. "What on earth in that letter has made you go pale, Lil?" "Letter?" "The one Moncrief just gave you, in your hand." Emily swept to her side. "As if you wouldn't tell your closest friend of some marvelously sordid tryst. Who is it, Lil?" "I know. The Duke of Marlborough has come to the States to claim you as his wife instead of my poor cousin Consuelo." "Consuelo," Lily managed to echo. "It's common knowledge, you know, about Consuelo's attempts at escape, her screaming pleas from a locked room. My Aunt Alva, though, remains determined her daughter will marry the Duke. Quite the family scandal." Lily flinched at that last word, and she rarely flinched. Her mother had alluded to it, that word, just before Lily had left for Biltmore. "You must be more open, Lilian, to offers of marriage, particularly given our particular unknowns." Only the troubles 4 years ago had induced her mother to relocate from a city Mrs. Barthélemy adored, New Orleans, to the snobbish squalor, she called it, of New York. And here Lily was, far deeper in trouble than when she'd left New York. Emily was dimpling now. "Whatever your secret, Lil, I'll have it out of you eventually." She swept a hand toward the mountains beyond. "George needs to check in with his forestry crew, and I've suggested we all go along with him. I'm angling, of course, for you're spending more time charming my perilously unmarried uncle." Exactly what she needed, Lily thought, a brisk ride outdoors to clear her head. Time in the saddle to think about what this letter meant, what she ought to do. She turned to find the mountain woman Carrie's eyes locked on the note. And then, evidently realizing it wasn't her place to be staring at a guest's private correspondence, she flushed and looked up. Lily stared icily back. Their gazes locked. Some sort of shock had sparked there in the girl's eyes, something about the note, its handwriting perhaps, that she must have recognized. Emily was just looping her arm through Lily's. "Shall we, then?" The eyes of the mountain girl, the little tart, would not drop from Lily's. To their left, Moncrief was standing, that ridiculous doggy grin on his freckled face. Emily lowered her voice. "I do believe his gloves are a finer grade kid than mine. Democracy is all well and good, but when the footmen are the better dressed, where does that leave us? One shudders to think." From the stables, George approached alongside a groom leading 3 horses between them, and just a few paces behind came Grant and Cabot astride. Lily made herself smile. She was becoming good at affecting ease, when what she was feeling was panic. She crumpled the letter inside her riding jacket. But the girl Carrie was still staring at her, as if she were making some sort of connection between the sender and Lily, as if this Carrie saw it for what it surely was. A threat to Lily Barthélemy of New Orleans, whom no one had ever dared threaten. Chapter 16. Sal didn't mean to threaten Vanderbilt's guests with violence. He didn't even mean to stray from the serpentine series of holes he'd been digging. But the bay mare at the crest of the hill was favoring her left front leg as the group approached, and Sal caught the stoical set of her head. "Remember," the foreman called from the other side of the stream, "Mr. Olmsted's insisting it'll only look natural if nothing's in a straight line. Ferns and shrubs in the front, bigger trees to the back." So focused was he on the horse, Sal paid no attention to anyone else or their faces as he approached, a pickaxe gripped in his right hand. It wasn't until the riders reined in their mounts and one of the men muttered, "Best always to be aware of potential anarchists," that Sal followed their eyes to the tool he held. On horseback, Shank shot in front of him. "Shouldn't you be working, Mr. Bagamini?" "Working," he pronounced it. "I have the concern," Sal explained. "The concern of mine is that you return to your work, Bagamini." Sal did so, reluctantly, but studied the mare from a few feet away. Seeming unconcerned by whatever threat Sal might pose, Vanderbilt addressed Grant. "If you like to join Cabot while he interviews some of the men, remember, please, that mountain people should be allowed their dignity." Cabot dismounted and tethered his horse to a post oak. Then, with a nod to Sal, he walked toward where Tate and a cluster of others stood watching. Grant began sliding less gracefully from the bay, who sidestepped on 3 legs as he struggled to release his left foot from the stirrup before flinging the reins over an oak branch and joining Cabot. Waiting until Grant turned his back, Sal stepped to the mare's peripheral vision, where she could best evaluate him. He spoke softly to her. "You no feel good, cavallo. I see that. Non ti farò del male. I know we'll hurt you." Head sinking, the mare stared off into the distance. Another bad sign. She stood stiffly as he ran a hand over her withers. "You are well cared for, yes? I see your coat brilla. It shines, amica mia." From several yards away, Sal could see that Cabot had seated himself on a log with several of the forestry crew, asking questions. "My impression, Mr. Tate, is that some here in your mountains may have received a surprisingly sufficient education to a certain point. I wonder if you could tell me a bit about that." "Ain't a bunch of illiterates, if that's where you're headed." "I didn't mean to imply. Had a school teacher during my growing up who took her job serious." "Could you tell me more of her?" "Miss Annie Lizzie Hobson. Give her a hell of a lot of credit, even being a lady school teacher. She could learn an old shote to read, give out books. Books that, forgive me, but were these books she bought herself and brought here as a kind of—" Tate spit to one side. "If you're meaning charity—" "No, I didn't mean that. She'd got people she knew in New York, college up there, took to sending down boxes of books. She took to spreading them out, gave out pulled taffy candy to us kids for memorizing big old hunks of poems, plays too." "Like," Cabot said after several beats, "The Merchant of Venice, perhaps?" "All that. Stayed a right smart while, back when folks here still lived on their own land." He stopped there, voice tight. "Back before there was foreigners here, back when things was safe." As Sal watched, Dirk Tate shifted his gaze to the Grant fellow. Sal thought for a moment they exchanged nods, like men who knew each other. But he dismissed that. They were from 2 different worlds as much as Sal and Tate were. Maybe it was just the shared detachment in their eyes that joined the 2 of them for him. Sal knew all too well how full the world was of men who appeared aloof, just like this, even as they molded that world to their own liking. Turning back, Sal was only vaguely aware the conversation behind him had ceased. Gently, he ran a hand down the mare's left front leg. Leaning his own weight against her body, he lifted the hoof. "Bergamini!" Sal jumped, but hung onto the hoof. The last thing this horse needed was for him to drop her foot painfully to the ground. Slowly, he ran a finger to where a stone had wedged its point between the wall of the hoof and the tender part of the foot's underside, its frog. After prying the stone out bit by bit so as not to further the damage, he traced the laceration. "Begamini, may I ask why you have left your work to play blacksmith?" Shank's W's had gone to harsh V's again. Work. But Vanderbilt turned to the forestry manager. "I wonder if I might ask Mr. Bergamini a few questions." Shank appeared to make himself pause before answering. "But of course." Vanderbilt knelt next to Sal. "Mr. Grant thought he detected a slight limp up that last hill, I believe, but he was rather deep in conversation." The scowl Sal delivered said there was no conversation so deep it warranted ignoring an animal's pain. Lowering the hoof along with Sal, Vanderbilt patted the mare's shoulder. "Forgive me." Vanderbilt directed this last comment to the horse. He turned to Sal. "I assume we should lead her back and not ride?" "Si. Yes, no ride. The Arab in her is her strength, but also her weakness. She will not show she is in the pain, perhaps much in the pain." "She does have Arabian in her, you're right, for endurance." Sal ran a hand down the mare's nose. "And for the looks, the Arab is the most beautiful of the horses." "You have experience with the breed, I take it?" "In Sicily we had much of the conquering, but it has given to us the architecture that is beautiful and much varied, and the line of the horse descended from horses of the desert and the horses of the knights, the Middle Ages." "You have a preference for the horses of the desert, then?" "The lungs are strong, the hooves are sound, they drink less of the water, they need less of the food. The intelligence, it is superior. The heads—" He returned a hand to the mare's nose with its pronounced dip, its wide nostrils, its eyes large and deep-set, the most beautiful of all. The others in Vanderbilt's party had drawn close, including the young woman whose horse had nearly trampled Nico and him in the forest that first night. Cabot lowered his head toward Vanderbilt. "You may have found a new addition to the staff of your stables." Despite the clang and shush of the digging behind them, the lady whose horse had reared in front of Sal appeared to be listening with particular interest. Vanderbilt addressed Sal. "You are the young man I met in Florence." "Si, I am. And yet you grew up far to the south, in Sicily." "There was no longer the work in Palermo, but when I was a boy, my father, he cared for the horses of a landlord and also the horses to rent. A livery stable. Yes, for the tourists to Palermo who came off the ships. From him I learned much." "I remember now that you not only took care of the luggage, but also cared for the horses at the Pensione di Giacomo. See, this is true. And I recall that they were beautifully tended." Sal knew pride was a failing, but so was pretending not to know his own expertise. "Yes, the finest of the care." Vanderbilt tapped his crop. "Your name, as you know, has been included among the suspects for the death at the train station. Many would advise me not to bring a man still under a cloud of suspicion closer in to my home." A cloud of suspicion. As if this were new. Sal could picture himself back in the darkened room near the Café du Monde, a few blocks from the wharves, the points of cigarette light and the hissed whisperings as he and Cernoia and the other dock workers argued. "Hennessy needs to be taught a lesson. Insanity, all of this. The last thing Italians here need is to be suspected of murder." "I will bring you no trouble," Sal said. The pronouncement was weak. Even he could hear that. No protestations of innocence. No proof. No alibi. Gathering the reins of his mare, Vanderbilt motioned with his head. Mr. Schenk, I assume you can spare this man while I decide if he might not be better suited elsewhere on the estate." Biltmore's owner waited for a nod, reluctant, but a drop of the head all the same, from his forester, then turned back to Sal. "Mr. Bergamini, if you'd please come with me." Sal could feel the eyes of the two young women on him, but he knew better than to look either one full in the face, especially not the one he'd met in the woods, the dangerous one. "So," that one said softly as Sal passed, "le bandit a trouvé une cachette." It was not difficult French to translate, even for Sicilian, whose language lessons came from hauling Parisians' luggage and laying out their Florentine picnics. "The bandit has a hideout." Without thinking, he turned to find her eyes on him. From what he'd overheard on the train, one of these women must be the daughter of Maurice Barthélemy, and he knew now in a shattering flash, it must be this one. Whipping back around, Sal jogged to catch up with George Vanderbilt and the limping mare. God help him. The daughter of Maurice Barthélemy. Chapter 17. Carrie rose before dawn and groped through the hay in the henhouse for eggs, Goneril and Regan pecking at her hand. King Lear strutted about, unwilling to ruffle his feathers by engaging. Cordelia hunched in the corner, her little head low. "You, Cordy," Carrie told her, "you cannot be sick. I got 3 people in there to feed. The math of your being sick won't work." A scuffling by the door. "What don't work, Care?" Yawning, Jersey stood there with red hair poking straight up from his head. "Doesn't." Eggs cupped in her left hand, Carrie turned from the shelves of nests to run her right hand over the ends of the strands. "I'd smooth it down, but you look so much like King Lear this morning, I think I'll let you two rooster about for a while." "Daddy's moaning in there. Tully's got the water to boil and the feverwort you picked soaking, but he's saying he won't down a sip, not even to ease off the pain. Says he don't deserve it. Because he doesn't." But Carrie allowed her first thought, bitter as ginger root, to go where most first thoughts should go, unsaid, skimmed off to leave something kinder beneath. "I'll come see, and if you've still got any rootstocks on those cattails," Jersey beamed. "Griddle cakes?" Carrie kissed him on top of his rooster comb. "Not the season for eating the cattail pollen you like, but you and Tulls get the coals stirred up good, and I'll have the rootstocks ground up in the batter and ready before I go." Slipping back through the cabin door and stepping over the box that arrived from New York yesterday, Carrie glanced down. A note from Miss Hobson. She'd gathered a small library's worth of schoolbooks for the twins. Tully had nearly fainted with excitement. She plunked down on the cabin floor with a McGuffey's reader. Jersey had only mumbled under his breath, "That much smarts in one place, it's like to make a man feel just real put out." Carrie fried up 2 eggs for her father and 4 for the twins to share, which used up the entire haul from the henhouse yesterday and today. Carrie added to their plates the dandelion leaves Tully had picked. They'd cook the roots later. Keeping her eyes on the fork, she fed her father his breakfast. From under the bed, Romeo let out a moan, as if filling in for his master. Pulling 2 of yesterday's biscuits from her skirt pocket, she tossed them under the bed for the hound. "Carrie," her father rasped, but she pressed a steaming cup to his lips. "This one's mayapple root, snake root, and ratsbane." He tried to form more words but couldn't. "Good for the liver," she said, still not meeting his eye. "For people that drank other people into their graves," she wanted to add, "and now are working on their own." Some days, and this was one, she felt as if bitterness were turning her insides to something like pine knots and sparks, just seconds away from exploding. She rose. "Thank you." The words seemed to take all the strength he possessed. She turned, his eyes pleading. He lifted the fingers of his left hand as if to touch hers. "At the station," he managed. "The murder. Tell me." From Rima's description of his condition, this was the most he'd managed in days. And there was more than just curiosity there, a kind of desperation, frantic and pained, to know more than whatever Jersey had already told him. She heard the reporter's words in her head. "The secrets I'm referring to cost a whole bunch of lives and mountains of money." But none of that could have anything to do with her broken, bedridden father. And all Carrie could see was her mama in that very bed, face contorted, struggling for air. This man, years younger, with a glass jar in one hand, his fiddle bow in the other, cursing and kicking the butter churn clear across the cabin. Carrie shut her eyes. A reporter for the New York Times was here researching a story. "Jew?" he asked, wheezing. It was the last question she would have expected from her father. Except for Saul Lipinski, who owned Bon Marché, had Johnny Mac ever even met anyone Jewish? She rearranged his pillow, its battling the stale of sickness and sweat. The victim was Jewish, yes. Nobody knows yet who did it or why. He's being a reporter with stories that could uncover secrets, or his just being a traveler with a wallet. Her father's eyes grew suddenly round. "Tate!" he croaked out. After trying to rise, he fell back. Easing him so that his breathing steadied, Carrie knelt by his head. "What about Dearg?" "Not him." He shook his head, but his eyes closed again, his body worn out. Whatever thought had dropped into his mind like a coin in a phonograph at the fair had vanished. She waited a moment, shakily, to be sure that was all. Silence from him. "The twins are walking down to my work with me. If you need anything, they'll be back soon enough." His next word came as not much more than a groan. "Where?" Or maybe it was only a groan. His or his old hound's. Or maybe he was asking where she was working, and she knew she would not say the word Biltmore to him. How ironic, she thought, that I would be the one in this moment feeling ashamed. Carrie tried to focus on her work and not where she was, or how the very size of the rooms upstairs dwarfed the people of Biltmore. The basement pantries and laundry and storerooms were a warren of servants' passageways where hurrying feet echoed on stone. Just one corridor and a whole world away, the guests lolled at ease from the bowling alley to the swimming pool to the dressing rooms. From the kitchen courtyard, Rima blew into the pastry kitchen along with a small cyclone of leaves and pine needles. "Well, I'll be pickled in whiskey." She stopped to kiss Carrie roughly on one cheek. "Good to see you here, hon." "I wish," Rima held up her hand. "Don't go thinking you're the first person to have to swallow her nevers and near choke. There's days for wings like eagles, but most of life's just the walking and trying not to faint face down in the mud." Carrie managed an almost smile from where she stood at the cutting board. "Fresh peaches in early November. Lord only knows how they get them here. Pineapples, too. Lord, you won't never guess who I saw coming in. Our friend from the train give the twins that cap, that Mr. Bergamini, out there with the horses. Sure's you're born." From the next kitchen, two heads popped around the doorframe. Tully, with her braids askew, and Jersey clutching a whimmy-diddle, its propeller still spinning, that their father had whittled years ago. "Is little Carlo with him?" Tully wanted to know. Carrie's hands went to her hips. "How are you two still here? You said you'd walk with me to see Rima and skedaddle on back. Mrs. Smythe won't appreciate your being here. More to the point, you've got somebody who might be needing your help.
We thought, Jersey explained, Aunt Rima's pastry might need some tasting, just to be sure it come out all right.
"Oui," came from the next room in a heavily accented male voice. "Just be sure it isn't hard as the stone of Montmartre."
I'd have thought, Rima called back, most highfalutin chefs brung all the way from France would know how to make something simple as rhubarb tarts. Turns out, just because you seen a big, ugly tower get built and shook hands with Mr. Eiffel himself, don't say a darn thing about how actual useful you're likely to be.
"From in here, I can still hear you," the chef called from the next room. To the twins, who'd paused at the door to listen, Rima tossed a fried pie apiece, steam slipping from their slits on top where cinnamon gold oozed onto flaky brown.
"Go on, then."
Jersey brightened.
"We're fixin' to see to Daddy, then go climbin' for possum grapes and muscadines, if there's any left. Mess of cattails down by the pond here. Reckon folks'd miss a few shoots if I broke off a handful to boil?"
Tully wagged her finger at him.
"We don't take a thing off Mr. Vanderbilt's land. Carrie can't be losing the last job she's ever liked to get."
Rima winked at Carrie as the twins turned to leave. "Don't stop her talking with Mr. Bergamini," Carrie called after them. "Go on now. Fast." Tully held up a hand like a flag to signal she'd heard as they thundered away. "And also," Carrie said, mostly to the pastry crust, though partly to Rima, "our friend Mr. Bergamini's hiding from something, going by a name that's not his. Rumors he may be an extortionist, a thief, and a killer."
"Oh, and an anarchist."
She turned to the sink and began scrubbing baking pans stippled with grease and flakes of crust. Rima poured a concoction that smelled of butter and thyme and chicken and cream into a pie shell.
"I got me plenty of friends with lots of straight in their narrow. Time I had a few with swerve in their wide."
From the next kitchen, Pierre groused a rumble of sounds that only occasionally formed a sentence. "The pastry in there," he called at one point, "I can hear from all these yards away, will be heavy." Rima smiled serenely as she pinched together the upper and lower crusts in a crenellated circle.
"Not the way I cut in the lard real good."
"Lard! Do not speak to me of the lard. I can see already that I will need a hatchet to cut these pies in a pot, however you call them."
"Is there nary a chef in Paris with more sugar mouth in him? I'd have thought a place like Biltmore wouldn't settle for mean and liable to chaw the cheese both."
Mrs. Smythe bustled in, then blinked in surprise at the silence she found on entering, only the scraping and splash of Carrie's scrubbing and a soft, tuneless humming from Rima.
"Ah, so on the culinary front, no one's got the cob on? No bad moods?"
Rima beamed up at her.
"Nothing but fair weather between me and my friend Pierre." "Splendid."
Spotting Carrie, she sighed.
"Miss McGregor, I do appreciate your industriousness, never sitting off, not even for a bit."
"I thought since I'll primarily be working the dumbwaiters once Mr. Vanderbilt has moved fully in,
and since there are no diners just now except—"
"Indeed.
So for now, do see to the lodger at the back of the house. Yesterday's storm dropped leaves everywhere, and it looks a poor show."
Carrie hadn't intended to cross paths with any of Mr. Vanderbilt's guests again so soon. She'd meant, in fact, to avoid them altogether. She found the loggia unoccupied, a relief. For all Biltmore splendor, its indoor commodes and hot water from faucets, its electric lights and a pool for swimming indoors, regardless of weather, her head ached with the vastness of it. She was beginning to feel like the creature years ago that her father caught in the stick-built trap set for whatever night prowler had broken into the smokehouse. The raccoon's eyes in their black mask were so mournful, so repentant. Carrie had thrown herself on her father and begged for mercy. Straightening from the wicker chair she was drying with a towel, she turned to admire the view, the rolling deer park and pond with the mountains rising beyond that. The air still held the muskiness of autumn, but with a sharp tang of balsam and the bitter cold to come. In the distance, she was sure she could hear not just the splash of Biltmore's fountains, but beyond that, the low roar of waterfalls. The truth was, she'd missed these smells, these sounds, these views so much, it had hurt. For all she'd admired in New York, for all the ways it expanded her world, some bone-marrow depth of her had come back alive here in her mountains. The November skies were a dark, menacing pewter, but she'd always loved November, the way the bare limbs of the trees opened up views that couldn't be seen in the warmer months, opened up secrets. "It's disconcerting, really," a man's voice said behind her. Carrie jumped. Mrs. Smythe wouldn't have sent a servant to clean the loggia this time of day if she'd suspected a guest would have ventured out into the wind. Carrie glanced both ways for someone else Madison Grant might be addressing. Briskly, she swept at the leaves. Disconcerting? It probably wasn't the right thing to do, engaging in conversation with a guest, but also a direct address probably shouldn't be ignored by a servant. Carrie flinched at that word, servant. The talons of regret it gripped into her. Grant swept a hand toward the view. Rather disconcerting that on a day like today, it's hard to distinguish the clouds from the mountains. Just range after range of the gray, all of it appearing to swell and move. This seemed to require no response from her. Disconcerting, too, how the panorama is unbroken by any sign of human habitation. Or does that remoteness not bother you, Miss McGregor? It's one of the things I love most about our mountains, actually. One of his eyebrows crooked upward. Our, he formed the word carefully. She'd not meant to include him in the pronoun. Those of us, she clarified, who've always lived here. Smiling, he turned back to the view. I must admit that when I look at these mountains, I have the oddest, most unaccustomed sensation of feeling small, almost insignificant, even on some sort of grand metaphysical scale. Carrie applied herself to drying the next chair. The light like this, he continued, the color of sterling silver, only with cracks of white in it, the immensity of it. The new wicker glistened with beads of ice, its fresh black paint still unmarred. If Mrs. Smythe were to peek outside from the tapestry gallery, at least she would see Carrie working, not standing and chatting with a guest. The peculiar thing is, I've a lifetime of looking at the ocean, summers in Newport mostly, but I've never felt quite this way. He turned from the view. Perhaps you've not seen the ocean? Rather than answer, Carrie bent to dry the next chair. Except for the past 2 years, she'd not left Buncombe County before. Madison Grant probably wouldn't include in seen the ocean, having walked past the wharves and acres of tenement housing on Manhattan's Lower East Side and New York Harbor. But the ocean has never made me feel small. Dozens of times I've stood on the very precipice of the cliff walk in Newport. He motioned to the drop off the loggia. Easily as steep as this, and a scene that ought to feel as immense, and yet... Carrie straightened. It's part of the role mountains play in our lives, to make us feel small, humbled. She offered this without looking at him. Ah, he drew alongside her. Do pause a moment to look. Carrie turned, let her eyes scan the roll and crest of the mountains, an ocean of dark, swelling gray-blue. She felt her shoulders relax. Madison Grant leaned in, brushed the back of his hand down her arm, and stepped in closer, his chest nearly touching her back. Chapter 18. For an instant, Carrie did not move. Couldn't. Reaching with a broom for a rogue leaf, she stepped away, did not look up, pretended she hadn't felt his touch on her skin. You know, Carrie, I don't believe George would mind one of his staff taking a moment to stand in awe at this prospect, the very reason he built his house here. His voice was smooth as sweet milk. I don't believe, Mr. Grant, that Mr. Vanderbilt pays his staff to stare at the view. Then think of it as you're helping to please one of his guests. With the others out in the deer park, the house is empty. Because, she thought, a small army of maids, cooks, and carpenters don't count. Carrie, I want you to know that I empathize with you. He stepped close again, so she could see the concern in his eyes, the buckle of his brow. In the abrupt change in your life, I know how you must feel. Do you, Mr. Grant? She was aware vaguely of internal warnings to stop talking, but the words were coming now unfiltered. I was raised in a one-room log cabin. That must have been horrific. It wasn't. She met his eye. Our other rooms were the mountain hollows and peaks. Our ceilings were the blue sky, the clouds and the fog, low one day, endless the next. I never owned more than 2 dresses at a time, with no burden of too much choice. That sounds... She didn't wait for him to grasp the right word. Growing up, I'd never slept in an actual bed or been to the symphony, but the pallet I shared with my siblings smelled of pine straw, and when my father was home and sober, we fell asleep to the serenade of the crickets and the stream that cut through our clearing and my father's fiddle on Barbara Allen and nothing but the blood of Jesus. That sounds appealing, Mr. Grant, and it could also be miserable, cold, and exhausting. As if a man like you, she stopped herself from adding aloud, could possibly understand. You with your soft, small hands and tailored clothes, your assumption that anything and anyone is yours for the grabbing. He stepped closer to her again, despite her hand on one hip, her fist around the broom handle. It must be a wonderful relief for you, working here now. She stared at him in disbelief. Here, she wanted to say, where envy stalks my every step, where every electric bulb and vaulted ceiling reminds me some people live without fear of a falling roof. Madison Grant brushed 2 fingers, only 2 fingers, over the back of her hand, then slid them away. I wonder if I might mention 2 things. Tense, she waited. One is that I've noticed John Cabot's interactions with you, how unfriendly he may often seem, for no reason. Mr. Cabot has no reason to be friendly to me, Mr. Grant, nor I to him. This sounded rude, she realized, but there it was, the muscadine jelly spilled out of the jar. Still, I feel I should offer this insight. I have good reason to believe that John Cabot and the poor late Mr. Berkowitz not only knew each other prior to this autumn, but, even further, were in love with the same woman. She let this wash over her. In love with the same woman. Meaning that John Cabot, who disappeared only moments before the attack, and whose wealth and connections with George Vanderbilt had apparently kept him above suspicion so far, would have had reason to kill Aaron Berkowitz. The oldest reason of all. Mr. Grant, you've told this to the police, I hope. Be assured I've had to wrestle with my conscience in order to do just that. I trust they will indeed follow up. In love with the same woman. Carrie dragged her broom across the stone, but the words reverberated inside her head. Brutality, someone had said in Beaumarchais, of John Cabot from, apparently, a few years ago. Could those same instincts have shown up again in a jealous rage at the train station? And regarding the second item, about your reasons for coming here, I wanted to offer my help. Truly. Still clutching the broom, she crossed her arms over her chest. I'm aware how difficult it must be, a young woman in your position. Forgive me, but I took the liberty of asking Mrs. Smythe about your situation when I saw you seeking employment, and then appearing here at Biltmore. If I may say so, I was startled that so well-spoken a young woman would work as a kitchen maid. Well, yes, after finding a life in New York, suddenly dragged back. It speaks well for the stock you come from, the strength you've shown. A tremor went through her, and perhaps he saw it, that his compassion had struck a chord. Thank you, Mr. Grant. She felt his eyes on her, heard the way the words came from her own lips just now, sounding very much, too much, like some sort of yes. Grant followed her gaze out to the rolling waves of gray and black. I like to think, Carrie, I'm contributing something of significance to this world in my law practice, my wildlife work, land preservation. He paused as if she were meant to comment. She swept harder. But particularly in my work that will have lasting impacts on the future of humanity. It's within our power, you know, to annihilate inferior traits and breed desirable, superior ones. Startled, Carrie paused in her sweeping. Surely she'd misheard. I'm sorry, did you say annihilate, Mr. Grant, and breed? If one is willing to root out the laziness and criminality we see quite starkly in particular nationalities, while propagating the industriousness and intelligence in others. Carrie stared at him. Surely you don't mean, she began. One of our leading researchers has shown how the poorer classes of people, particularly in the slums of London, were also of a lower intellect. Nationalities we know to be genetically inferior. Here in the Appalachians, Carrie held up a hand. You're probably not accustomed to having your ideas challenged, particularly not by someone holding a broom. But surely you're not suggesting people are poor because they're genetically inferior.
This is the end of disc number 4. Please insert disc number 5. This is disc number 5.
He stepped toward her again, voice smooth. Your intelligence and your industriousness, I must tell you, are tremendously appealing and evidence of your Nordic stock. Before she could jerk away, he ran a hand down the line of her jaw. As is your striking beauty. The porch, she said, momentarily paralyzed, is finished. He reached to lift a stray lock of her hair. Her feet moved at last. She whipped toward the lodger's far door. Grant's voice hung in the air, hazy and soft as a patch of poison ivy catching fire and turning to smoke. And as lethal, Carrie thought. Remember, Carrie, I'd like to help you. Stay around to inhale that. She broke into a sprint toward the stairs, and it'll blister your insides. Chapter 19. Dusting inside George Vanderbilt's office, which was tucked into the southwest corner of the library, its door nearly invisible in the woodwork, Carrie heard her name, and a scattershot round of bickering. She stepped closer to the door. If Mrs. Smythe had complaints about Carrie's work, she needed to know. Tully was right. This job of Carrie's might be their last chance.
What bloody business of ours would it be, I ask you now? Away and bile your hide.
That was Moncrief. Only the impenetrability of his Scottish brogue must be saving his life. Mrs. Smythe must not have made out what he'd said. Boiled your head.
I'll thank a footman to keep his temper in my house. Your house, is it now? My house to run it is. I wasn't brought across the Atlantic to sit idly by while the upstairs and down mix into proper gruel. By which you'd be meaning. I'll not pretend to be blind when Biltmore guests are seduced by a maid.
Carrie felt the blood rush to her face. Moncrief guffawed.
I'll not be an old clype. I'll not be a snitch. But I can tell you this much. It's not that direction the burn has been flowing. Meaning? Meaning that not every lass as bonny as her is a wee knife. A what did you say? A nuisance by distracting the lads. The lads they know how to hunt on their own. Still, a young woman such as that can cause problems. Aye, and was there yet a young man who wasn't naught but a problem with a leg on each side?
Mrs. Smythe's answer came clipped.
I'll thank you, lad, to watch your language.
Then she sighed. I confess I like the girl, although it's a proper stew of motives even the nice ones can have. I shall speak to her myself of the dangers of moral turpitude.
Even a bright young thing can be thick when it comes to the attentions of a rich man. So, the braw and bonny Mrs. Smythe speaks from experience, does she? Let's just say I had my share of opportunities offered.
Through the crack in the door, Carrie could see Moncrief dropping a theatrical bow.
And long may your lamb reek, I say. I beg your pardon. Long may your chimney smoke, that is. Long may you live and prosper.
Mrs. Smythe huffed as she turned to exit the library.
Moral,
she called back to Moncrief, following not far behind.
Turpitude. Aye.
A chuckle rumbled below Moncrief's words.
Moral bloody turpitude.
Cheek still flaming, from anger now more than embarrassment, Carrie slipped out of Vanderbilt's office as laughter and shouts broke just outside the library's glass-paned doors. Several figures, people and horses, appeared suddenly on the bowling green that bordered the south side of the house. To reach the bowling green, one had to take a stone staircase that Lily Barthélemy had evidently just ridden her horse up. She dismounted, head thrown back, and gathered her reins to hand to someone. Marco Bergamini, Carrie saw now, who must have come sprinting across the front of the house from the stables when he'd heard the commotion. As the other guests milled about Vanderbilt and his horse, Lily Barthélemy paused for just an instant near the library's windows as the Italian reached her. Carrie could only see his face, but his eyes were all thunder and clouds. Closer to Vanderbilt on the lawn, John Cabot suddenly turned. Unlike all the others, he stood unmoving. His eyes appeared to rest on Lily Barthélemy, tracking her. Like a barn owl, Carrie thought, stays perfectly still while it watches a mouse. What was it Madison Grant had said? In love with the same woman.
Ah, Carrie, there you are.
Carrie snapped the drape and spun around. Pursing her lips, Mrs. Smythe leaned toward the window as if she'd settled on what had drawn Carrie's interest.
Mr. Grant it was I saw, on the loggia with you.
Drawing herself up, Carrie reached to unload a stack of books from a crate. The guests here can apparently move about as they please, even places someone else has gone with a motive, she met the housekeeper's eye squarely, of sweeping.
Sweeping, yes, it's the sweeping that was needed.
Mrs. Smythe's voice was tight, nervous, and then seemed to change direction.
The vase here, did I tell you? Ming Dynasty, that.
She brushed the feather duster over its broad circular rim,
which was, I've no bloomin' idea when. Very old." She lowered her voice. "And Chinese. There's your exclusion act here. Do not let any more of them in, mind. The people, not the vases. A muddle, if you ask me."
Carrie looked up from the leather-bound copies of the Atlantic Monthly and the American Architect she was unpacking. "You had something in particular you'd like to say, Mrs. Smythe?" The housekeeper frowned.
"There is, yes. About what I observed."
In a blur of brown and white fur, Cedric bounded up just as George Vanderbilt appeared at the doors opening to the bowling green. Nodding to both women, he approached the shelving where Carrie stood. "Yes, marvelous. Thank you," he'd said. "Just onto the shelves, obviously, that have been properly finished. And has everything made the journey intact?" Mrs. Smythe was first to respond. "All the books are arriving in brilliant shape, sir. Carrie here works like a ferry on the channel, never sitting off for a rest." Vanderbilt smiled down at her. "Glad to hear it." But then his smile faded. Gesturing to the top of the stack of American Architect in Carrie's arms, he shook his head. "See the bookmark in that one?" Glancing down, Carrie nodded. "Open it, please." She did. The pages falling open to an article with large photographs of wood-paneled rooms and marbled floors and carved pillars. "Royalty in Louisburg Square," she read aloud from the title, then looked up. "One of your homes?" Mrs. Smythe's face behind him said that last comment must have sounded presumptuous, but he merely shook his head. "My friend John Cabot's family, actually. We met in Maine just before the article ran, so I marked it. But then," tail flapping, Cedric charged for the door. "Ah, speak of the devil. There you are, John. I was just mentioning—" But there he stopped, reconsidering. With one finger he closed the volume, handed it back to Carrie. Cabot's gaze swung over the room, then stopped on her. Unblinking, she returned his look. If he'd been in love with the same woman as the Times reporter, could Cabot have been the attacker? Madison Grant might be a vile man with loathsome ideas, but John Cabot could still be the prime suspect for the reporter's murder, especially if he were as prone to violence as had been suggested. By Grant, she reminded herself. Erin Berkowitz had tried to warn Marco Bergamini about at least one of the gentlemen. Watch out. The murdered reporter must have had information about one or the other or both of them, and that information perhaps had been enough to get him killed. Vanderbilt clapped Cabot on the shoulder. "Let's take a ramble down to the base pond, shall we?" Allowing himself to be swept with Vanderbilt toward the door, Cabot glanced back just once, but Carrie turned away toward the bookshelves. A man whose family home was so grand it was featured in a magazine about princely architecture. No wonder the police and the doctor and the city leaders of Asheville, no one seemed to harbor so much as a fleeting thought that the blue-blooded John Quincy Cabot might have been involved in the attack. Carrie ripped open the next crate. "You had something you wanted to ask me, Mrs. Smythe? About the loggia." "Some men," the housekeeper said at last, "have got to be taught to keep their kecks on, their trousers, love." She leaned heavily against a red leather chair near the hearth. "Well then, I'm glad we've had this talk." The smile Carrie suppressed tipped up one side of her mouth. "Me too." Mrs. Smythe's head jerked toward where Cedric had been sprawled by the fire. "Whenever you're able to clean where the drooling stuffed bear of a beast has been, do see to it." She lowered her voice. "No wonder Mr. Vanderbilt has not married yet, for all his excellent points. There's the head-to-toe fur of a St. Bernard clinging to his clothes, even when the beast isn't at the moment dribbling onto his shoes." She flung a hand toward a table across the room. "And there aren't many young women who can be wooed, more's the pity, over a chessboard." She huffed her way back to the door of the library. "Yet even with all the chess and the books and this great sprawl of a house far past nowhere, there seems to be no shortage of women vying for Mr. Vanderbilt. He's a dear lad, that he is." Mrs. Smythe, Carrie caught the housekeeper just as she reached the threshold. About my father, who is ill. Mrs. Smythe's face lost its detachment a moment. What is it, love? That's what Mr. Grant approached me about on the loggia. He offered, or wanted to make it seem as if he were offering sympathy, because of my circumstances, which I believe you may have told him about. The housekeeper nodded her lips to one side. Perhaps it was a bit much I shared with a gentleman, she sighed. From long years in service, let me leave you with this, love. A person's innocent until proven guilty, as they like to say here in the colonies. So then, Mrs. Smythe pivoted. Innocent until proven guilty, with just one exception, which is, if that person's a man, the opposite should be assumed. Chapter 20. Lily was standing at the threshold of the library when she caught sight of the maid, the one who appeared to see and hear and remember too much, to take in everything around her like some sort of red-headed sponge. She felt her pulse slow, a sure sign of risk up ahead. Lily was not like other young women of her set, catty and deceptively cruel. She was, however, ambitious, and a note like she'd received earlier could be the undoing of her future, as could a little maid who might have recognized the handwriting and assumed some sort of liaison between Lily and the note's sender, or, far worse, a connection with the reporter's death. Here was the maid now in George's library, which still smelled of new lumber and old books, and whatever adhesive they must be using to hang all those cherubs and clouds on the ceiling. Aurora, Lily corrected herself. Not random cherubs and clouds, but a masterpiece. The Chariot of Aurora. If she expected to vie for George's attention and distract from any stray whiffs of scandal, she'd need to think and sound like a woman who understood art, assuming she could dredge up the terms she'd not heard since her last trip to Europe. Chiaroscuro. Wasn't that one of the words Americans tossed about in the Louvre when they stood awkwardly before Rembrandt's? The juxtaposition of light in the Pellegrini, she might try out saying. Whatever it took to keep George's attention away from strange notes delivered to Lily, or rumors of how Maurice Barthélemy had left Asheville in such a rush, or what the Times reporter had come here to ask. Meanwhile, there was this maid to be dealt with. Lily squared her shoulders. She did not trust other women. Men could be managed in any number of ways, but women, who weren't supposed to be too publicly clever, could be slippery creatures whose intellect often sprang out, ambushed, in unpredictable ways. This little maid from these mountains was savvy, that much was clear, but perhaps she could be persuaded to keep her mouth shut. Now, though, the housekeeper, Mrs. Smythe, was charging into the room, pausing only for a "Good day, Miss Barthélemy," as she passed. "Carrie, you're needed in the kitchens, love, to peel potatoes and to negotiate peace between Paris and Appalachia." The maid stopped her unpacking and returned Lily's looks with one of her own. The maid's eyes never dropping as a maid's should have, she fell into step beside the housekeeper and hurried for the stairs leading down to the kitchens. Lily would have to watch for the next chance to catch her in private. Soon. Standing beside her in a clearing up a steep, brushy slope at the back of the house, George Vanderbilt was holding out his shotgun for her. Several days into the visit now, this was their first hunting excursion. Grant and Cabot stood some respectful steps behind the pair with their own weapons over their arms as her lesson commenced. Emily, wearing a cunning little woolen jacket and a smirk, watched the scene from a few steps behind the armed members of the party. Lily made sure she reached for the shotgun tentatively, like a woman who was frightened of firearms, Fumbling it a bit, she lifted the gun stock to her cheek, ran a gloved hand over the barrel. "So well polished." An inane comment, but better one that made her look feather-headed than one showing what she felt. Suffocated by a corset, the drag of her skirt through the clearing's tall grass, and this role she had to play. This was the price of survival, feigning big-eyed incompetence when she was all but quivering with impatience, like the panting spaniel holding his position at their feet. She ached to set the dog loose and follow him into the brush, to raise the double barrel amid the sudden, desperate cacophony of birds, driven to the wing, and squeeze off 2 blazing rounds in such quick succession that the birds struck the earth as one. "Control yourself, Lily." "So shiny," she added, and cringed at her own voice. Regardless of the abundance or the paucity of a man's possessions, he should take painstaking care of all that he calls his. Lily turned to meet George's eye. Had he meant more by this than the proper maintenance of firearms? "If you'd like me to demonstrate some tips about leading a target, Miss Barthélemy," she smiled up at him, "I'd be so very grateful." Wrapping one arm around her shoulders, George repositioned her weapon. "When the quail are flushed, you'll want to take an instant to plant your feet, feel the wood of the stalk against your cheek, and focus on a single bird, not the flock." His breath near her ear, his cheek brushing hers, he nudged the gun down to the right. "You'll be swinging your firearm up and through from behind the bird, sweeping from tail feathers to body to beak, and then bang, pulling the trigger as the muzzle passes the beak. The key is to breathe deeply, to remain calm." Yet she could hear his breath coming faster. His gloved hand covered hers on the trigger. "I'll be right here behind you." Did he really imagine she felt nervous about pulling a trigger? Her own heart rate at a preternaturally slow thud, Lily was scarcely aware of the others in their group standing in a clutch behind them. When at last the dog was released, "Hunt, Girth," Vanderbilt all but whispered, and shot into the brush. She followed without hesitation, leaving all of them quickly behind. Her mistake, perhaps, the initiative that said she wasn't a novice at all. But hang it, there were birds to be shot. Nose to the ground, the dog was visible only in flashes as he crashed through the brambles, quartering relentlessly toward the next open space. Seeing where Girth must be headed, Lily hurried to that clearing's edge and took her position. As the dog thrashed through the last of the brush, and the 3 men, huffing, caught up with her, a covey of bobwhite exploded into the air. In a triumph of restraint, Lily emptied only 1 barrel. The quail tumbled to the earth. Grant and Cabot shot 2, one of them missing, one of them dropping a quail. Girth went happily about his business, collecting the birds. George beamed. "Well done, Miss Barthélemy." "Merci beaucoup." She cocked her head at George. "Beginner's luck." Emily had by now joined them. Her tone was telling, a drawl that mimicked Lily's own remnants of a New Orleans accent. "Why, however did you learn to shoot like that in only 1 lesson?" Lily shot her friend a look. Women never betrayed each other on these little deceits, not women who wished to remain friends. George's enthusiasm bounded over her silence. "Beginner's luck indeed. Marvelously done." Leaning into him ever so slightly, she handed the gun back to him. "The credit is entirely due to my teacher." He took this in, blinked, and then smiled. After lunch, the group went for a ride, then after a time dismounted and, leading their horses, strolled over the fields, golden brown, and beside the French Broad River that wound through the estate. Above were the mansion and the blue mountains beyond. George stopped, his hand scratching under his horse's mane, but his eyes on the bottomland that rolled out on either side. I hope, you know, for the estate to be entirely self-sustaining. The forest, the crops, the dairy, the nursery, all of it. John Cabot drew up beside him. I can see why anyone would feel so powerfully drawn here. Despite the destitution of the natives, Grant added, and the harrowing depths of their ignorance. Cabot's retort came with a vehemence that made everyone turn. Poverty, I'll grant you, grinding poverty even, but we've witnessed examples of keen intelligence. Less access to formal education, of course, but a striking intelligence nevertheless. For a moment, no one spoke, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps and the horses across the dried grass. Emily splashed into the quiet.
Why do I think that Mr. Cabot is thinking of one intellect in particular rather than the whole of the Appalachian populace?
There was teasing in her voice, and a taut thread of jealousy, too. She dimpled in his direction. Stuffing both hands in his pockets, Cabot pivoted back toward their host. There's something mysterious, something magnetic even about these mountains of yours, George. It pulls one in, powerfully.
Could the magnetic draw, Emily asked, have anything to do with the red-headed little maid?
Cabot only turned his head away. With a rare flash of sympathy for him, compassion was not Lily's first instinct. She changed course by addressing their host. I'm so glad you planned for us to walk the land with you. It reminds me, said Grant, of my big game hunting excursions out west, where I first became passionate about conserving our land, and where I committed myself to the preservation of the American bison, who once roamed throughout our great country, but whose numbers have dwindled now to the mere hundreds, an icon of our country's history, nearly lost to extinction. That, Cabot muttered, seems a better use of your time than some other pursuits. Emily, bless her, cocked her innocent head.
Forgive me if I'm not understanding, Mr. Grant, but were you hunting the very big game you're hoping to preserve from extinction?
Perhaps, Miss Sloane, it would help you to view the thing from the other end of the telescope. If we don't more assiduously preserve the wildlife and their habitats, there will be no more big game to hunt. Emily appeared unconvinced, but Grant had already turned to George. Another friend you and I share in common would be my fellow Boone and Crockett Club member, Theodore Roosevelt. He is a friend of mine, yes. I wasn't aware the two of you knew each other. Not only know each other, but have hunted together and discovered we share so many important perspectives, including the need to implement urgent measures to forestall the decline of certain species, not only in the animal kingdom, but also... He paused there, and seemed to be weighing whether to go on. Well then, I'm glad to know of yet another friend we share in common. Vanderbilt shot a smile at Lily, that simple trust again she could see. She led her horse closer to his. If I confide in you, Mr. Vanderbilt, in admitting that I prefer this... She swept an arm across the vista. To even Mrs. Astor's ballroom, would you promise not to report me to the keepers of New York society? You have my word. I value my time outdoors, especially here in the Blue Ridge, as much as I expect to in my library. It is one of the great gifts this country has to offer, oui? The outdoors, I mean, pristine, unspoiled, abundant. Forgive me, but I'd have to differ with you on the unspoiled nature of the land. He looked genuinely apologetic at having to disagree with her. Lily marveled that this man could have come from the same family of men who dominated American business for decades now, devoured their competition whole. Of the thousands of acres my agent McNamee has purchased thus far, much of it had been over-timbered and over-farmed to the point of depletion. It's been our challenge, restoring the forest and fields to something vital and fertile. Everything about your estate, Mr. Vanderbilt, suggests vitality. Lily held his gaze. Tout le monde. She meant him to hear that she included the owner of Biltmore in this evaluation. She watched his eyes widen as the realization washed over him, a wave of affirmation of all he'd accomplished, of what he dreamed for the future, of who he was. Lily Barthélemy knew a thing or two about men, the first of which was that most of them possessed only a fraction of the confidence they tried to wear like a rack of 16-point antlers. But here was the youngest child of 8, an artist and a scholar, grandson of a tyrant. With her affirmation, she just earned more of his trust. She liked George Washington Vanderbilt II. She was startled to realize. Genuinely so. It was Cedric the St. Bernard who disrupted the moment, the dog bounding around the horses and up to its master, then wiping a wet muzzle against his wool trousers. Lily concentrated on not wrinkling her nose in distaste. George stopped walking to scratch the creature behind his ears. Cedric's litter was from Bar Harbor, you know. Shifting the reins to his left hand and kneeling to scratch the drooling beast under his collar, John Cabot's tone was low and affectionate. "You're a magnificent creature, Cedric. You know, you're the first St. Bernard whose acquaintance I've been honored to make." George was clearly basking in the praise of his dog, which let Lily know she would be making friends with the slobbering beast, and therefore changing clothes more than the usual 7 times a day. "About the murder," Madison Grant put in suddenly, apropos of nothing, and jolting their calm. "Forgive me for bringing up a subject none of us wants to relive, but I feel we should keep abreast. Has there been progress in the investigation?" Lily's pulse dropped to a faint thrum. Beside her, Cabot's hand stilled from scratching Cedric's oversized head. As if, Lily thought, he's also uneasy with his subject. George frowned. "Wolfe rode over this very morning to update me. Apparently, something new has come to light." Cabot straightened. "What was it?" It struck Lily how very guilty John Cabot might sound to anyone not already assuming he was beyond suspicion. "Wolfe has been interviewing everyone he can find who was there to learn what they saw. Apparently, several names continue to come up. Ling Yong's for one, Robert Bratchett's for another. And there's also, I'm sorry to say, my own stable hand still among the suspects." "Not Mr. Bergamini, surely," Emily said. Grant tilted his head, considering. "Interesting." He glanced her way. Or was it Cabot's? "Though hardly surprising." Lily's blood seemed to still in her veins. She had no sensation whatever of breathing. No one in this group except Emily and George would be aware Lily's father had been here and left in a rush, and Emily's naive sweetness made her slow to suspect anyone of anything ever. No one here but John Cabot seemed to remember the New Orleans story. As if he had his own reasons for disliking the topic, Cabot was looking straight ahead. Grant smiled amiably. "From among the 3 current suspects, we have the common thread, genetic descendants of Africa, Asia, and Southern Europe. So far south, it's nearly to Africa and the Middle East. They can't be expected to have the same moral fiber as you or I, George, or Cabot, or your excellent niece." Lily noted the flicker of hesitation before he included her in the next nod. "Or our crack shot, the lovely Miss Barthélemy." Cabot glanced wryly her way. "Apparently the French, too, will soon be asked not to breed." Grant bristled. Vanderbilt turned slowly, stiffly, as if his spine had been fused into a solid rod. "If I'm following what you're suggesting, merely that some races of humanity are simply beaten men of beaten nations, particularly those of darker hue, as it's been proved, with a proclivity toward theft, toward rape, toward murder." "Good God!" Cabot exploded. "That's Francis Walker you're quoting. That crowd and their pseudoscience. Let me suggest you let the president of MIT teach you what he can about numbers and gather your science elsewhere." "Really, Cabot, your temper." "My temper is hardly the threat here, and it tends to be triggered by stupidity." Lily braced for Grant's fury, and she could see George doing the same, poised as if he expected fists to fly next. Instead, though, Grant only smoothed his mustache, then smiled. "I hardly think this is behavior becoming a gentleman. Scientific inquiry," he enunciated both words, "ought not precipitate raising one's voice." "Scientific quackery," Cabot shot back. His face was a deep, dangerous red. "It's biological determinism, plain and simple. We autochthonous Nordics evolved from Homo europaeus, with the hard winters of the northern European steppes and forests eliminating defective genes and producing a race of men renowned for virility, strength, industry, and intelligence." "With you as a prime exemplar, Grant? Is that where all this leads? To your ego?" "We are, quite simply, what our genes have destined we will be. No amount of education, social workers, sentimentality, or religious pity for the poor and weak changes that." "No." It was George's voice this time, more harsh than Lily had ever heard him, as much of a slap as it was a word. "You're wrong, and your ideas undemocratic. Yet you yourself, Vanderbilt, are a shining exemplar. Your Dutch ancestry, your grandfather's industry and savvy, the genetics that gave your family the capability of earning and deserving its wealth." Lily held her breath in the tension. Picking up a stick, George hurled it with a force that startled them all to stillness for several moments, except for Cedric, who bounded after it. "Let me say this, Grant. I have no wish to banish a guest from Biltmore, ever, much less one of the nation's leaders in land and wildlife preservation, and a man with whom I share any number of friends." A "but" hovered there in the mountain air. "So perhaps we can agree on at least 3 things from today's conversation." "And those would be?" George ticked them off with his fingers. 1. That the attack on Mr. Berkowitz was a horrible thing. 2. That the assailant must be found. Indeed. And the other? That perhaps the quite admirable wildlife and land preservation efforts you've led would be better topics for the future. "My only goal in all my work," Grant said evenly, "is preserving what is good, making room for that which is best to thrive." Turning, Cabot sprang angrily up onto his horse. No matter what, apparently, or who, that means rooting out. He urged his gelding into a run, stopping only at the far side of the field to wait for the group. Grant cleared his throat, his tone smooth and unctuous. Lily pictured oil dripping from the tips of his mustache. "I will, of course, adhere to any request of our gracious and generous host." No one else spoke, And George, Lily noticed, fixed his eyes angrily on the mountains ahead. Lily welcomed the clatter of their horses' iron shoes on the brick, a cover for the brittleness of their silence as they made their way back to the front of the house. The stable hand, Marco Bergamini, reached for her horse's reins. She meant to avoid meeting his eyes. But dismounting, she landed with her face inches from his. His eyes were crackling, full of explosives, as if she thought suddenly some sort of rage had made him unstable, as if all that anger were directed at her. Taking the reins from her, he stepped to the horse's left side close to Lily. "You," he said, so low that no one else could have heard, "you are from New Orleans." Now she was struggling to breathe. So her memory from that day George hired him had been right. This Italian and his little brother had been part of that night of torches and death, had been, incredibly, under her very window. So this Italian might know who she was, what her father might have arranged, might be looking soon for a chance to exact his revenge. So then, perhaps, she would take the offensive. Chapter 21. Sal was reaching for the currycomb as she entered, gliding toward him with some glittering, secretive purpose. Dropping it and picking up a cotton cloth, he buffed oil into the leather of an older saddle, buffed it hard. What the daughter of Maurice Barthélemy was really after in coming to visit him all alone, Sal could not imagine. And whether she recognized him as one of the Sicilians accused of killing Hennessy, and one of the few who'd escaped from the jail the night of the lynchings and the riot, he had no idea. He watched her eyes. She scanned the tack room in a leisurely way, as if she had all day to be here, watching him, like some sort of long arm of her father, more beautiful and maybe just as deadly. From beside the saddle soap, she lifted a page from the shelf. He moved to take it. Her eyebrow arched. "Is this your work, Marco? This drawing of a house?" He hesitated, gauging if he could trust her. Probably not, but he could tell the truth on this much at least. "It is. I know proportion and design when I see it." She scrutinized him, the eyebrow arching still higher, as if he were a stray cat who'd learned to paint. "It's actually very good. Do you sketch these often?" Hesitating again, he stepped to a lower shelf where he'd stacked others. She flipped through them. "Incroyable! You wouldn't mind if I showed these to George?" It was more statement than question. Yes, he did mind, but Nico would be back at the boarding house even now, probably huddled in the kitchen with the landlady peeling potatoes. The boy's face crumpled with worry, as it always was these days, and had been for years. Sal couldn't jeopardize his position here and risk losing Nico again. Sal stared back at her without speaking. No need for an answer where there'd been no question. She aligned the pages and tucked them under one arm. "Now, what I would really like to know," her voice had dropped, breathless and low, "is what Sicily was like." Her tone said that wasn't all she'd like to know. Her real interest could not possibly be the question she'd asked. Still, he could see Sicily as if he were there, parts of Palermo peering over cliffs to the sea, parts tumbling down terraced hills of vineyards to a turquoise bay. Resuming his oiling and buffing of the saddle and keeping his eyes on its pommel and skirt, Sal began slowly, looking for signs of a trap. "From a distance, Palermo is much the pretty, the hillsides with the grapevines, below the blue, bright blue, of the sea. Up the hills are the churches, the mosques, the piazzas, streets that wide." "Churches and mosques?"
Invaders, they come. They like the island for the good life. The weather, the domination by sea. The invaders, they have been many. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, barbarian tribes, the Arabs and Spaniards, the French. Intriguing. But if Sicily was conquered by so many others, your people could hardly be the marauding, extortionist villains that one always hears. Ignoring what her comment implied, he continued buffing. He would keep his face as still as Michelangelo's marble. He would not let her see his fear that she knew who he was, what he knew of her father, and had come here with a reporter to expose. She leaned closer. She smelled of magnolias, voice soft as petals, her eyes watching him work. Tell me more of your country. A request that had nothing to do with New Orleans. Maybe she really did not know who he was. Maybe she had no idea he'd learned who she was, her father's daughter. And so, how reckless it was for her to have come to face him alone. He looked up to meet her eyes as she shifted infinitesimally closer. The buildings, they crumble. The new Italy that is unified, it has the center in the north. The, how do you say, rebirth. The north with the wealth, it has little of the interest in Byzantine mosaics that chip or Gothic arches that collapse. Byzantine, she repeated, as if she enjoyed the buzz of the word in her mouth. Delicately, slowly, she licked her lips. He could kiss them, he realized, could pull her to him and kiss those lips. She wanted him to, he could see that. At least part of her did. His own body throbbing, he stared at her. Whatever dangerous game she was playing, he could not let himself play too. Focusing back on his saddle, by now it had a coppery gloss, he steadied himself. For the north of my country, Sicily is the nuisance, the island of trouble that Italy's boot must kick away. She ran a finger down a length of girth on its stretcher. What of the women? Most often left all alone to survive. And you? Here it came, her questions about Hennessy's death. She tinkered with a curb chain of a bridle hanging from a brass hook. Did you leave a woman alone back in Palermo? Sal straightened slowly, the scent of leather and grain and magnolias filling the air. A woman alone. Sometimes in their boarding house, just before sleep, Nico still whispered, "Mama, Mama died." Sal would kiss the child's cheek then and murmur, "Buono, you made the full sentence," because there was too much else behind that to even begin. "Our mother," Sal said now, not looking up, "my younger brothers and mine, she died. This was why Carlo needed to come with me to this country." He did not meet her eye to see if she'd noticed the slip of his brother's name. "I'm so sorry," said Maurice Barthélemy's daughter, "about your mother." As if she meant it. Several beats passed, her voice softer still. "And you had no girl you left behind?" Sal pictured Angelina at the market, the red awnings angled over the street, the purple and black and green of the grapes mounded at her waist up to her chest. "Come back to me, Salvatore." For a moment, Sal did not speak or move. "There was," Lily Barthelemy whispered. "Yes." He turned back to buffing the saddle. "But she has married my friend." "Oh, how terribly hard." He made himself lift one shoulder. 5 years. It is too long for a beautiful woman to wait." 5 years. She'd pulled that from him. Or he'd offered it, open-palmed, like a fool.
She had proof now he'd been in the country the year Hennessy was killed, and proof he'd lied about the 3 years he told McNamee and Vanderbilt the day he'd been hired. Maybe this had been her purpose, to catch him in a lie, to ferret out who he was, what he knew. After snatching up a currycomb and sliding the door of the nearest stall open, Sal entered. Each stall was surrounded by oak walls up to the horses' shoulders, then topped with wrought iron bars painted a glossy black. Directing all the energy that would have him move closer to Lily Barthélemy and press her to him, he ran the currycomb in hard circles on the mare's neck. "And your house?" she asked. "What was it like?" Who could say what she was trying to draw from him now? "It had the walls of stucco." Flaking, he could have added, "and the roof of red tile." As many tiles missing as were still on it, some blown off in storms and some pried off by thieves, but this he did not say out loud. She glided to the edge of the stall, grabbing 2 of the wrought iron bars as she peered in. "Sounds enchanting." "Yes," he agreed, because that was what she wanted to hear. But enchanting it was not. He worked in silence for several moments. The only sounds, the munch, munch, munch of the horses grinding grain between their teeth, and the shush, shush, shush of the currycomb on the mare's neck. And sometimes a louder percussion, the stomp of the occasional hoof on the wood shavings that covered the brick. Maurice Barthélemy's daughter ran the forefinger of a riding glove down the length of one of the bars, a kind of caress. "I've been wondering, Mako." His whole body gone tight. His circular swipes became stiff. The mare turned her head to ask what he was doing, and why with so much force. Stroking her nose in apology, he moved to her barrel and flank. "I've been wondering about the murder." He stopped brushing a moment, frozen. "The one in New Orleans or the one here?" he nearly asked. "You know, Marco, there are people who think you did it." His heart pounded in his throat, his palms gone so sweaty he could hardly hang on to the hard wooden oval. Both arms dropped to his sides as he faced her. He knew by the look on her face that his expression must have gone dark. Her voice dropped to a whisper, sultry and slow. "Though not me." Slowly, she let go of the iron bars, stepped so close he could feel the warmth emanating from her body here in the chill of the stables. She tilted her face up to his. For a moment, she stood there, lips parting, and him looking down, arms by his sides, wanting to pull her to him. He could not let himself move. "Maybe I should tell you, Marco Bergamini, what I know for sure about you." He waited, throbbing. "I know." She leaned in so close now that her cheek pressed into his, then her lips brushed his ear, "that for all your strength, you could never hurt anyone. Ever." Her right hand skimmed over his curls to the back of his neck. For an instant, she pulled his face closer to hers. But now she leaned slowly back, eyes still on his, and swept out of the stables. In her wake, she left the scent of magnolias here in the midst of leather and hay and the sweat that streamed down Sal's back. Chapter 22. Uneasy about Dirk ever since their talk at Biltmore, Carrie had kept an eye out for his lurking, in the shadows of the smokehouse, in the chestnut grove near the falls, in the town's dark alleyways. Because something had changed him, the stabs at his pride from the millionaire outsiders, maybe, or her coming back from New York, but not returning the same. Like a wild boar with a bowie knife lodged to his chest, Dearg Tate had been wounded by something deep in his core. And that hurt would likely come out less like a curling-up moan and more like a roar. She knew this, too, about him. For all his size and strength, there was something childlike about him, something easily made afraid. And that's what made him most vulnerable, being used as someone else's bullhorn, someone else's pawn. He'd avoided Carrie so far, had brawled all over town in taverns and on street corners. The stories found their way back to her. Dearg Tate's gone to pickin' fights. Says you and him is still likely to set up housekeeping one of these days. But he'd given her a wide berth. He'd not been in town when the attack occurred at the station. There was proof of that. But he'd been infected by some sort of fear and an anger that hadn't been there before. On this particular morning of her day off, she'd gathered the eggs and changed her father's bedclothes. She'd fed him oatmeal with dried honeysuckle for sweetness. There was no more syrup from the ground cane. Despite his eyes looking unfocused today, his mind seeming to float in some other realm, she'd pressed a hot tea with dogwood bark down his throat for the pain. Halfway through changing his shirt to his other one, which Tully had brought in from the line, Carrie decided she had to confront Dearg. In person, she might be able to see in his face a shard of the truth. "How come," Jersey wanted to know when she announced she'd be making the trek to the Tate farm, "you ain't marrying him? He used to be awful fixed on you 'fore you took off for New York." Tully gave him a superior look. "You don't got to marry every man that goes fixed on you." Carrie smiled. "My little sister is wise beyond her years." She left the twins back at the farm, stretching the squirrel skins they'd tanned over the banjo hollows they'd made from gourds. The neck of the older banjo their father had made had cracked after years of hard use. "Mr. Bratchett said it's got to be tighter than that," Tully insisted. "Tighter than this. It'll split clean open." "Not if you do it right, like mine is." They'd keep each other distracted at least. Carrie forced herself up the last climb of the path. Exhaustion from her work at Biltmore and caring for her father had been knocking her flat for the few hours of sleep she could steal. Today, her need for answers outweighed her need for rest. A raccoon scuttled, then froze in place at the branch of the stream. "What are you doing awake in the middle of the day?" Carrie asked him. The creature lifted both paws, then dropped to all fours and began following her. "Better go your own way, little guy. Where I'm headed, you don't want to be." Out of old habit, she moved through the woods soundlessly, careful to step on the soft, spongy soil rather than dry leaves. The Tate cabin sat just ahead in a clearing encircled by maples and a handful of small outbuildings, the smokehouse, the barn, the chicken house, and a privy. On all four posts of the cabin's porch, raccoon pelts were nailed to the logs, heads and tails and all, as if the creatures were climbing up to the roof, 8 in all. Like the stone lions, she thought, on either side of Biltmore's front entrance, a decoration with no function, a kind of welcome, and also the human urge to signal abundance and wealth, whether or not it was true. From the cabin's back door, a path wound down along a moss-bound creek. From somewhere down that way came a clang of metal on stone. Quietly, she slipped down toward the sound and watched Dearg from behind a stand of mountain laurel. Making adjustments, he bent over the spiraled copper tubing, spigots, and barrels. When she stepped into view, he glanced up, gave the jerk upward of the head that was the mountain man's greeting. "I need to know," she said, because there was no point in not addressing this thing directly. "What's going on with you? Rumors all over about your brawling, things you've said.
None of it like the man I remember. Jaw working side to side, he said nothing. She could see in his face she'd been right, a flicker of fear passing over what he always was, the laconic mountain man, and now also a fair piece of defiant. She felt like she was being sighted down a gun barrel. Maybe not the only target of whatever it was he was feeling, but the one standing there. She braced her feet wider apart. "You don't scare me, you know." He let several beats pass as he glowered, then looked away. "Sure way to get yourself hurt, if you ask me. Acting like there's nothing can hurt you." They stared at each other. A threat, it might be, or a warning. Suddenly, voices sounded from up the path, and the clomping of hooves. Deer glared at her, a look of betrayal. "You brung people with you?" Carrie shook her head. "Only the twins knew where I was headed." A scattershot of voices she could make out over the rush and babble of stream, women and men both. Snatching up his Winchester propped against a stump, Deer jerked his head back toward the spirals and vats and barrels. Carrie nodded. These strangers, rich and northern and from the outside, didn't need to see the still. Without speaking, Carrie and Dirk climbed together halfway up the path where they could hear more clearly, but still not be seen. Now the squeak of leather as the group dismounted near the cabin. Carrie peered through a feathering of hemlock. There stood horses whose coats glowed in the gold slant of late afternoon sun. Biltmore horses they had to be. And its people, George Vanderbilt and his 4 guests. Here, of all places. "Why is it again," the niece asked, "we're disturbing these people?" The niece's friend swept a gloved hand at the cabin. "Perhaps they'll want to join us for the ride back down to admire the Rembrandts and Sargents." John Cabot frowned, maybe at that bit of snobbery, or maybe at the smell of smoke and burnt sugar. Either way, his scowl deepened as Grant rapped at the cabin door. "Whose cabin?" the niece's friend asked. "Did you say this was? Or do we know?" But Vanderbilt, looking uneasy, didn't answer. Only a faint whistle of the wind through the pines and the distant tumble of waterfalls. Grant rapped again, this time using the end of his crop. The cabin door creaked open, a crack of only a couple of inches through which a gun's muzzle appeared. A shot ripped just over Grant's head, zinging through the white oak just behind him. "Good God!" Grant cried, staggering back. He looked as if he might faint. Carrie could taste the sulphur of gunfire that hung in the air. An eerie, hollowed-out silence followed, as if the mountains were absorbing the blast. "As I mentioned before," Vanderbilt said from behind him, "the mountain people need to be approached slowly, with consideration." Grant turned back to the door. "For God's sake, hold your fire." From behind the crack, one eye peered out, along with half a forehead. Dirk watched, looking half tense, half amused. His right hand spun the Winchester up so that his finger rested on the trigger. He'd always been quick as a cougar, Carrie knew. The youngest, but one of 12, for years he'd probably felt he had to be something other than the biggest and strongest and best. Shaking her head at Dirk, Carrie reached to point the Winchester's barrel down toward the ground. "You one's a government man?" came from behind the door. "Most assuredly I can answer that in the negative, my good man." "That mean hell no?" "Yes, that is no. I am decidedly not a government man." The boy poked his entire head out now, the rest of his body still blocked by the rough pine door. "You talk funny as hell." As Dirk gave a low, warbling whistle that drifted through the trees, the boy's head swung around. "Hold up now." Pulling what looked like a thick cigar case from his coat pocket, Cabot unlatched an accordion-pleated bellows with a lens on one end
and snapped in a cylindrical cartridge Carrie assumed held film. Only tourists from up north owned portable Kodaks like this, and Carrie resented his using it here. Emily shot a smile, winsome and sweet, his direction.
Goodness, loading in daylight.
Cabot nodded, but did not look up from threading black paper onto a reel with a brass fitting. Raising the Kodak to eye level, he aimed the lens at the raccoon pelts, advanced the film, then aimed at the other outbuildings. Carrie drew a deep breath and held it to keep from speaking. The boy put up a hand.
Let me check down yonder first. If you uns can just hold on to your breeches. Make sure it's all right.
Breeches, John Cabot murmured. To Vanderbilt, he said in a low voice,
It's fascinating, the connections of their speech with Elizabethan England, Scotland, and Ireland, as well as Africa, significantly. Their speech, the construction of their homes, the methods of farming, their musical instruments, all of it hardly evolved from earlier eras across oceans, like a time capsule here in the hollows of the Blue Ridge. Hardly evolved, as if she and her people were only a newly discovered set of Charles Darwin's apes who'd not yet mastered the art of two-legged upright ambulation. Carrie wanted to smack him, all of them, across their 7-course meal faces. The boy flung open the door and grinned. Come to cogitate on it, Dirk told me to sit tight or he'd skin me alive. Let's just hope he don't think you'd be government folks come to smash up his work, him being a hell of a shot.
Indeed, let us hope. Carrie cringed at the strangers exchanging glances. What right did they have to assume they understood her world after only a few days in it, and even those they'd spent sequestered away in a fancy hotel and a castle? On the contrary, young Tate, Grant pronounced, we have come here with the offer of help. The door, which had been inching closed, now flew back open again.
We ain't looking for no help from outsiders.
That ferocious independence you mentioned, Cabot lowered his voice again to address Vanderbilt, but Carrie could hear every word. The Industrial Revolution has exploded all around them, yet even for those who understand there are places now where one can turn a tap for hot water or flick a switch for light, none of this is appealing. It's intriguing, that drive to remain separate from the civilized world. Carrie bit down on her lip, the arrogance of the man to think he understood. Grant gave the boy a tip of the top hat.
Farewell, then, young man. Like to get your private shot off? The boy said, brightening.
Grant paled. Dirk emerged from behind the trees, the Winchester slung under one arm. Vanderbilt stepped forward. Mr. Tate, some of my guests expressed a desire to see more of the traditional culture around Biltmore. Please be assured you're under no obligation at all to show us your place, if you'd rather we left. Grant, having left his horse standing beside Cabot's, strode toward the screen of pines to the right of the cabin. Grant, Vanderbilt's voice carried a sharp reprimand. We've not been invited to walk Mr. Tate's property. Dirk was stepping forward, raising his rifle, when Carrie laid a hand on his back. He paused, seemed to consider. His gaze shifted to Vanderbilt. The gun dropped back to his side. Mr. Tate, Vanderbilt said, anything you show us or not is your choice, with, a look passed between Dirk and him, no repercussions. Which Dirk must have understood referred to something specific, because to Carrie's utter surprise, he turned on the heel of one mud-slathered boot. What the hell? Don't matter now what you people see. He stomped away down the path, then barked over his shoulder. Follow me. I'm unaccustomed to being ordered about, Grant quipped to the women, particularly not by someone who couldn't spell unaccustomed. Stiff with fury, Carrie slipped into the path behind them. Only John Cabot, scribbling notes as he walked last in the line, heard the rustle of leaves behind that made him turn. Startled, he touched the brim of his hat. Their eyes held. "Ah," Grant pronounced as the group reached the clearing. "Moonshine. Also known as white lightning. Income the government has long wanted to tax." Releasing a valve at the end of one spiraled metal tube, Dirk held a tin cup underneath a dripping clear liquid. "No photographs here," he ordered as Cabot raised the Kodak. Dirk held the cup up for Grant, like a dare. Grant swiveled to address the others. "There is a reason, after all, that the government wishes to regulate the making of liquor in rusted metal pipes and pots. It can blind one, I've read." He spoke as if Dirk Tate were deaf, or too dense to make out the words. Carrie's chest burned. Grant lifted the cup toward his mouth, but then swept it out in a kind of toast. "No, thank you, my good man." He'd already half-turned back to the others as he thrust the tin cup back at Dirk. Spotting Terry there at the back of the group, he opened his mouth in surprise. "Ah," Grant said, "a vision of loveliness here in the wilds." Recoiling, Carrie said nothing. John Cabot was looking from Grant to Carrie and back. A few feet away, Lily Barthélemy, the friend of the niece, was trying to slip past the still, her head turned away. But Dirk thrust the cup in front of her, making her stop. The niece's friend froze, fixed a look at Dirk. "I believe I'd like to taste it," Lily Barthélemy announced, her voice cold. "This homegrown brew of which I've heard so much." She snatched the cup from him and tipped it up to her mouth. "C'est bon," she said, licking her lips, voice husky. "It is very strong." She paused, looked up into Dirk Tate's face, the air taut with those words. Her finger slid away from the cup. "Merci," she whispered. Carrie's breath felt caught in her chest. Whatever she'd just witnessed meant something, though just what, she'd no idea. The group made its way back up the path to their horses. Numb, Carrie followed behind. That Dirk would allow these complete strangers to pound on his door, tromp on his land, even see his still, it made no sense at all. Madison Grant walked beside Dirk, chummily, as if they'd met before. Grant lifted his face to say something to Dirk that Carrie could not hear. The others mounted and trotted ahead, while John Cabot lagged back with Vanderbilt. Carrie could feel Cabot's eyes on her, could feel he was wanting to speak. Leaning down from his saddle, Vanderbilt held out his hand to Dirk. "Do please forgive us for disturbing your privacy. I am well aware the land is still yours through the end of the year. I want you to know I respect that. I'm glad, Mr. Tate, that we were able at last to come to an agreement." Jaw dropping open, Carrie stared at Dirk. John Cabot was nudging his horse close to her, leaning down as if to speak quietly, but, fists curled, she was already marching past him toward Dirk. "You sold?" She could barely make the shape of the words. "So that's why you didn't care what Vanderbilt and those people saw, 'cause it's already as good as his. My God, Dirk, you said you and Bratchett and me, we were the last, said you'd never sell, not if he offered you millions." In one movement, Dirk raised his rifle and fired over their heads, the gun's report echoing over the trees. That was his answer, she knew. The total of what he would tell her right now, like that blast as the bullet left its chamber, was the sound of his loss. A bullet shot into the blue sky but falling through the pines to the ground, powerless now. A man who'd soon have a wad of money in hand, exiling himself from his home. Carrie stood alone outside the cabin as he mounted the porch and slammed the door so hard that chinks of clay fell out of the logs near the frame. When exactly John Cabot gave up on speaking with her and left, she didn't know. The sun beginning to sink behind the mountains, Carrie hugged her arms over her chest. She suddenly felt very cold and very alone. Carrie told herself she was playing the fiddle that night to calm the twins, who'd been harried all day by a restive Johnny Mac, cantankerous, ungenerous hens, and Malvolio, who'd brayed for hours as they tried to tighten the tanned hides over their banjo gourds. But the truth was that she needed to play for herself. She'd not picked up a bow for years. Her father had taught her the fiddle when she was hardly old enough to stand. She tuned the strings now with a kind of frantic need to hold her life together by wrapping the betrayal in strains of music. Long and mournful they came, each song she played, songs handed down through the decades, centuries even, songs of sorrow and longing and loss. She played on as the twins fell asleep, their hands blistered, but both their faces smoothed into peace for the night since she'd come home. She played as her father lay staring up at the ceiling boards of their cabin as if scenes from his life were flickering there. Or perhaps, Carrie thought with a stab of pity, he's seeing its end. She was finally lifting the fiddle back to its place on the wall when a rustling stopped her, a soft rattle from inside the fiddle's body. Turning it over, she shook it. A rectangular paper fell behind the strings, but was blocked by the size of the hole. Shaking the fiddle and using her fingers like pincers, Carrie plucked the small paper out, blank on one side, so maybe only a mistake that it had fallen inside. On the other side, though, two men in a faded photo stared back at her, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, their military uniforms crumpled. Behind them, an American flag. Even with the blur of the black and white, Carrie knew their uniforms had to be blue. Two soldiers, two buddies, two neighbors. The man beside the much younger version of her daddy was Robert Bratchett. Turning toward the bed where her father lay, she held up the photo. His eyes latched onto the image, and even across the cabin's one room, Carrie saw the spark of recognition in them. Silently, she crossed the floor to him. "Daddy?" She asked it more gently than she'd addressed him since she'd come home. He could lift one hand only an inch or so off the bed, but he reached for the old photo. He opened his mouth as if he would speak, but no words came out. Instead, the tears flowed, and he turned his face to the wall. Chapter 23. A week had passed since her visit to Dirk's cabin, and Carrie still felt betrayed and bitter, as if she and the Bratchetts stood alone, two little islands of independence surrounded by a rising ocean of wealth they couldn't possibly keep back forever. She'd taken her day off this week to spend at the farm, as always, but also to walk here to Riverside Cemetery with the twins. Carrie spotted the Italians across the graveyard. The older one's walk stealthy and quiet, his eyes darting left and then right. Like a fox sniffing for hounds, Carrie thought. He held his brother's hand, the boy swinging his bad leg in arcs to keep up. Guiding Tully and Jersey behind a fold of the hill, Carrie watched the Italians moving from gravestone to gravestone, heads ducked. "It's an awful long walk from the farm to Mama's grave," Tully's voice wobbled on the edge of exhaustion. Jersey placed a hand on each knee to help himself up the next incline. Riverside Cemetery was like a blanket of homespun that someone had lifted in the middle and set gently down, with its steep, stiff folds all around, leading up to a peak. "Reckon Carrie's got to be more tucker than us, taking her afternoon off to come here." Tully scowled at being bested. Giving both their shoulders a friendly shove, Carrie heard her brother's comment for what it was, tender-hearted compassion, and also positioning himself as the currently sweeter sibling. Tully left her scowl intact to ask, "Carrie, you reckon he wishes he could go back in time? Do things different?" Carrie didn't have to ask who he was. She let a breath out through her mouth. "Reckon none of us lived past 13 without something we wished we'd lived better." Tully frowned at this, evidently reviewing her young life. "I reckon," Jersey charged ahead, "he's been trying to show he's changed." Tully crossed her arms. "You always did defend him, every last time." "He always needed defending," Jersey returned simply. The three of them pulled to a halt in front of a simple headstone with no dates, only a name. Missy Murray McGregor. Even that had cost them a goat they couldn't afford to lose. Jersey's forehead buckled. "How come she didn't want to be buried on the farm with Daddy's people?" "Because," Carrie hesitated, "Mama's people were more from Asheville itself." She pointed to other graves nearby with the name Murray. And because the twins were only 13, only teetering on the ragged tin edge of adulthood, she didn't add the full bucket of truth, that their mama had had enough of the farm and a life of privation by the time she passed. Her final luxury, her first one in years, had been to be buried in town, with her maiden name and extra expense on the stone. In death at last, she'd finally taken her stand. Tully was still nursing her scowl.
This is the end of disc number 5. Please insert disc number 6. This is disc number 6.
He could have quit off the drinking before when he did. Carrie recollects better'n us how bad it was, how sad it made. She nodded toward the headstone as her eyes filled. Her. Carrie had no words to push back at this. She knelt to brush leaves off the gravestone. As if re-seeing scenes now that she'd not been old enough to understand at the time, Tully stood looking away. "I think Mama hated him sometimes for it, and then just her being swole up with sadness. All those babies she lost." None of them said the word stillborn, but all three of them looked at the gravestone. A good half-dozen brothers and sisters born blue, not breathing. Their mother had wanted "and children" added to her marker whenever she died, but when it came time, their father could only afford her name. "And," he slurred, drunk for 3 days straight after her death, "how the hell did look, that and children, with the damn 3 of you not very damn dead?" Carrie's expression was rueful as she turned back to Tully. She loved him enough to hate him for all the drinking, 'cause when he drank, he wasn't himself. Tully knelt to trace the letters of her mother's name. "And I think she hated herself a good piece, too, for acting like nothing much happened after he'd got to raging or shot through the roof. How about you, Carrie? You forgive him yet?" Carrie linked her arms through her sister's. "I'm trying," she wanted to be able to say, if only for Jersey's sake. But even that wasn't much true. She scanned the undulating green and brown of the cemetery, the rhododendrons with their waxy green foliage curled against the cold. No more sign of the Italians, at least. She released a breath in relief. Quite possibly they meant no harm, but whatever in their past brought them here, made them change their names, made the older one jump every time the door of the train opened, best to keep the twins clear of trouble. Ciao. The Italians appeared from behind a row of marble monuments, little Carlo a shadow behind his brother. "How long have you been there?" she asked it calmly, not quite an accusation of spying. Still, she had Tully and Jersey to protect. The twins both ran to little Carlo, Tully's whole body bouncing as her arm pumped up and down, shaking his small hand.
Marco Bergamini, or whatever his name really was, gestured back with his head. "I am looking for a man who perhaps is here. A man who," he searched for the word, "carried my brother one night."
"Carried your brother?" the twins asked together.
"When it was thought I had died, in another place far from here." As if offering this next phrase up to Carrie's scrutinizing stare, he added, "New Orleans." Jersey's head tilted.
"I thought you come from Pennsylvania."
Bergamini shifted his weight.
"Before Pennsylvania, before the cutting for stone in the quarries, we lived, my brother and I, in New Orleans."
He smiled at them sadly.
"And before that, Italy, Florence, and Palermo."
Carrie did not miss his shifting of weight, his uneasiness, but there was also something fractured in him that struck her as unable to hold in the spillage of lies very well, as if he might now be ready to offer up truth, or a piece of it.
"I ask all over town when I have the afternoon not to work. I ask about the man Cernoia, if he came here as we have heard, if he is still living here."
He shook his head. Tully's eyes saucered.
"So your plans to knock on every God-loving door in the Blue Ridge?"
"Si."
Jersey swept a hand over the cemetery. "If you all'd be looking here, sounds like you ain't even sure this man Cernoia is still alive and kicking."
Tully smacked him.
"You don't got to say what's strung up and salted right there in front of your face, Jers."
Carrie had already seen those words, the weight of them in Marco Bergamini's eyes. He shook his head. "Non lo so. He may be dead, yes, and also," this part he seemed to consider whether to tell them or not, "there may have been the reason for the man to change what was his name." "Like you?" Carrie asked, but more gently now than she did on the train. Hesitating again, he lifted his head, then lowered it just a notch, a nod. Almost imperceptible, but a confession, she realized. Carrie gazed out over the hill, rumpled and studded with gravestones, then ended on her mother's marker, Miss Murray McGregor. "Do you know any of the names he might have been likely to use? His mother's maiden name, maybe. Or maybe there are names in Italian that had meaning for him. Like a profession, yes. In Sicily we have many of these sorts of the names. Abate from the priest, agricolo from the farmer, cavolo from the horseman." "And Bergamini?" Carrie asked. "What?" He blinked. "Your name, the name you're using at least. Is Bergamini from an occupation?" "Oh, our name, Carlo's and mine, Bergamini, that too, yes. From Bergamino, the cowherd, or here you might say the dairy farmer. Grazie. I will think, and I will write to Palermo to ask." Without speaking again, Bergamini fell into step with them as they followed the river back toward town. At a bend in the river, Jersey picked up a piece of paper, crumpled and soiled, that the wind had blown to his feet. Tully jerked her head. "What's got your face screwed up like a dried turnip?" Jersey held up the paper. "Know your rights. Don't let your job, your home, or your family be stolen by thieving foreigners." 4 caricatures illustrated the flyer, 1 in each corner. At the top left hunched a man, leering, with a shaved head and a long, thin black braid down his bare back. "Disease" had been scrawled across his forehead. In the top right was a man huddled with the Star of David emblazoned on one bare arm, a yarmulke on his head, the word "lies" scribbled on it, and a fistful of cash in one hand. And, Carrie thought, a reporter's notepad stuck in one pocket, as if Aaron Berkowitz were somehow to blame for his own death. At the bottom left was a man whose skin had been inked in dark and whose muscles bulged, his right arm wielding a scythe. The word "violence" lettered over its blade. At the bottom right was a man with a grizzled chin and a head of black curls. Dominating his face were wildly bushy black brows, an enormous black mustache, and a menacing smirk with "Anarchy" spelled out across the bared teeth. At the bottom center, like a signature, were the letters LNA. Where had she seen that before? An image clicked into her head. The telegram whose message she'd crossed through to use as her letter to ask for school books for the twins. A telegram sent to Madison Grant. Something about the LNA growing in influence, especially among educated people. And the odd part about a rooster, a Reichsadler, whatever that was, and a bald eagle. And then that last line that especially stuck in her mind. Continue to spread message. The race will be lost if we continue this way. So Madison Grant must be connected somehow with these flyers. Are these, Jersey whispered, supposed to be monkeys or real actual folks? Carrie lifted an arm over his shoulders. I think that's the point. I'm sorry all of us had to see this. Tugging at the paper to take it from her, Carrie risked a glance, just a shiver of one, at the faces of the two Italians. Only moments ago, she'd been shielding the twins from them herself. She crumpled her end of the flyer, but Bergamini stopped her. He ran a finger over the bottom right image. My hair, it needs the cutting. She laughed, relieved. Plucking the paper from him, she shredded it into confetti she tossed into the air. Lifting both arms, little Carlo turned in a circle, his face thrown back to receive the flurry of white falling around him. Evviva! He cried, an 8-year-old's delight with pretend snow. Jersey hoisted the child up onto his own skinny shoulders. The bad paper's all gone. Carrie smiled at Carlo, who was curling down over Jersey's head as they walked together. A clatter from the street they were passing made her glance left. Dirk Tate, in a grey hat and red homespun shirt, was just slipping behind a corner, a hefty stack of white paper in one arm. There, at the corner of the street, one of the flyers hung tacked to a lamppost and fluttering blithely in the breeze. Not all gone, she murmured in little Carlo's direction as the child giggled on Jersey's shoulders. Not all gone at all. Chapter 24. Carrie had the distinct sensation of being watched, but each time she spun around, no one was there. If she hadn't promised herself they'd try a kind of help for their father, bought from the drugstore in Haywood, she'd have headed them all for home. But the image of her father's skeletal face, the pain in his eyes that he wouldn't speak, made her keep walking through town. LNA, she mused. What might that stand for? Jersey touched Carrie's arm. My stomach's gone to hankerin' so loud, I can't hardly hear nothin' else. Tully shot him a glance full of disdain. Aunt Rima said muling's only for barn cats. Scowling, Jersey stopped. You gonna let her talk to me that-a-way? Carrie waved him forward. No skirmishing among our own troops, please. Asheville streets bucked up and down so that its shops seemed to be trying to hold tight, awnings braced and brick mortared thick against the pole, to keep from sliding to the bottomland of its valleys. A 3-mile walk from Biltmore Junction's sprinkling of structures, Asheville was bigger and more established, but still small enough to feel like a village that kept tumbling over and down the next hill. Up ahead on Spruce Street, a gentleman steered a black horse. A shock of dark blonde hair fell onto the man's forehead as he bent to adjust the bridle. Look, Jersey pointed, one of them rich men from the station. Tully tilted her nose in the air. Aunt Rima said it was him caused a ruction by calling our Carrie the village milkmaid. You won't catch me trading howdies. The air smelled of maple wood burning in hearths and balsam from the nearby forest. Carrie could never think quite clearly with Balsam nearby. Reining in his horse directly in front of them, Cabot touched the brim of his top hat. "Good afternoon." For all his big city polish, he seemed to flounder for what to say next. "I hope you each are well." Jersey scraped his right toe on the street. "Could be a heap better." Carrie shot Jersey a look. "We are well," she said evenly, "and we hope you are." "I was out for a ride, not looking for anything or anyone in particular." The words came too rushed, then too slow, as if, she suspected, he most definitely was looking for something or someone in particular. "How nice," she said, not helping him. She remembered again his disappearing behind the train station, his never volunteering to the police that he'd met Aaron Berkowitz somewhere before, his having possibly been in love with the same woman as the murdered reporter. Cabot cleared his throat. "So then, no doubt, Mr. Cabot, your friends at Biltmore are waiting for you." He only shifted in the saddle, though, as if he wanted to speak but didn't know where to begin. "They say," Jersey blurted suddenly, "Mr. George Vanderbilt's got himself a whole field worth of carriages here. If our roof finishes out the fallin' sure enough, maybe the gentleman here'd put in a word for us to sleep the night in one of them settin' empty." Carrie tried to catch Jersey's eye to make him see the fire in hers, but he was chattering now to John Cabot directly. "We could bring Daddy too, course, ride him down on Malvolio's back, just the four of us curled up inside, put nobody out." Mortification rose through Carrie's chest into her neck, her face. Glancing her way at last, Jersey dropped his voice. "Should I not have said that, Carrie? Don't be riled." Cabot stared at her. "Your roof, is it really in danger of collapse?" Carrie's cheeks throbbed. "If you'll excuse us, we need to be getting back." Grabbing a hand on either side of her, even though the twins were too old to hold hands, Carrie bolted back into motion. Hesitating, Cabot touched a gloved hand to the brim of his hat. They'd climbed the next hill before Carrie turned on the twins, both clearly afraid to speak. Her hands went to her hips. Jersey ventured something first. "Hadn't we ought to answered him about the roof?" Tully spoke up, tentatively, as if she knew too much volume just now might trigger her sister again. "We don't want to end up all out of friends like the little match girl from our storybook." "We are not out of friends, nor are we out of a home." "But the roof," Jersey attempted. "Then we'll sleep in the barn if we have to. Malvolio won't mind sharing." Both twins seemed to sense they shouldn't mention just now how the wind howled between the boards of the barn in winter. Carrie dropped a hand on each shoulder, partly to comfort and also to say they needed to keep hushed for a while. In silence, they walked beyond the busiest, most elegant of the shops on Patton Avenue. Haywood was a quieter contrast to Patton, the former striped awnings muted, its storefronts less brilliantly lit. But the effect was pleasant, like the bookish child content in her corner of the schoolhouse. The shop windows were filled with kettles and ironing boards, with red wagons and leather-bound volumes of Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle. But none of them had the more competitive gleam and glitter of the Patton Avenue shops, like Beaumarchais. As if the shop owners here, Carrie thought, would rather relax, read a few chapters of a good novel, and steal a sip of honeysuckle wine between customers before turning back to the cash register. They swung into the drugstore on the corner, Carrie pulling a few bills from the pocket she'd sewn into her skirt. "Cash money," Tully admired, "that Biltmore gave you." Then, with a frightened glance up at her sister, she added hastily, "that you earned yourself." At the counter, both twins picked out green penny candy with a white stripe. "It's like your one brain," Carrie muttered, amused. Then to the druggist, she said, "Is that chill tonic an actual help, do you think?" He turned with a brown bottle in hand. "Folks swear by it for the heart palpitations, the dropsy, liver complaints." Grove's tasteless chill tonic had advertisements splashed everywhere, even in magazines up in New York. "But does it actually cure anything?" The druggist winked. "Even when it don't, it makes the body think it does, which is sometimes the same equal thing." Carrie bought the tonic. Handing her the change from behind the soda fountain, the druggist pushed forward a frothing glass of brown liquid. "Company's treat," he told the twins. "Free samplings." "Coca-Cola." Tully fixed the druggist with worshipful eyes. "Never yet tried it." He smiled back at her. "Got a nice kick to it." They drained their cups. "Enough kick," Carrie said to the twins, "to hurry us on back home." They made their way faster now down the street, but something at this end felt wrong. Too quiet, like a landscape of downed streets right after a storm. Carrie slowed her steps. "That's Mr. Ling's shop, 55 Haywood, but—" Tully let out a long whistle. "Glass all over the street." Jersey ran ahead. In front of the shop, he squinted. "Lord, what's below pearl mean?" Carrie and Tully drew alongside him. The letters, painted in a sickly ochre, had been splashed across the jagged shards of what was left of the plate glass window. Carrie struggled to make out the letters. "I think it's yellow, not below." She sucked in her breath. "So what's special about a yellow pearl? And why'd they spell it P-E-R-L? Haywood Avenue seemed snapped still in time like a photograph, as if all the other streets continued their bustle while this one lay stunned. Carrie lifted a finger to the ochre paint, still wet and dripping. "I'd say the person who did this couldn't think a lick better than he could spell." "So what'd he go meanin' to say?" From inside the shop, something stirred. A man, his shirt sleeves rolled up, ochre paint blotting one arm, whose face suddenly turned toward the shattered window. "I think," Carrie said, rigid with fury, "he meant yellow peril." And she stared back at John Cabot. Chapter 25. Carrie struggled for air. On either side of the shattered glass, neither she nor John Cabot moved. "So what's a peril do?" Jersey wanted to know. Behind Cabot, Carrie could make out shelving hurled on its side, the contents of tins and barrels and crates strewn across the floor. Potatoes and beets, brown sugar and bolts of calico, laid trampled together. She returned her gaze to Cabot's. "It's a term, an unkind one, that some people use. But what's it signify?" "Peril means danger." That was all she could stomach to say. Tully was pointing to a portion of the window still attached to its frame. In large, barely legible letters, another word was scrawled, and misspelled. "Murderer," she read slowly. Eyes wide, she turned. "Who is Carrie? Is the murderer here?" Glass crunched at the back of the shop. Kicking at a hillock of flour, Ling Yong appeared, then watched the cloud of white snow drift down onto his sparkling floor, little slivers of glass like so much ice. "Ruined. All of it." Cabot dropped his gaze from Carrie to turn to the shop's owner. "I wish I knew what to say." He glanced back toward the shattered window, the painted smear of words, to make it less reprehensible. Through what was left of the window, Ling spotted the twins and Carrie. His eyes were so deep brown they appeared black and bottomless. Carrie felt as if she were falling into a pit of despair. Without speaking, Carrie stepped through the open door and held out her hand. Looking around the ransacked shop with wide eyes, the twins followed. From behind a barrel, the one item still upright, a little girl of about 3 emerged. Clomping forward in 2 large shoes over the rubble, she stopped beside her father and slipped her hand into his. Tully stared. One of her hands lifted, as if she might touch the black hair that silked down the little girl's back. "Our shop," the little girl said with a defiance far bigger than her small frame. "They came to our shop." The child's words hung suspended in air that was still fogged with what must be flour and sugar. Carrie could taste it on her tongue. "My daughter Jeanne," Ling Yong said, with a hand on the child's back. He gestured to hand-drawn pictures tacked to the wall. Several bore the letters of her name she'd apparently scrawled, Z-H-E-N. Jersey cocked his head doubtfully. "It's got a Z here, but he pronounces it wrong, like it'd be nothing but J." Which was so like Jersey, to stand in the very center of chaos and find some kind of anchor in the distraction of how a word ought to be spelled. Jeanne looked from one to the other of them, her dark eyes already guarded, searching the strangers for signs of future betrayal. Carrie scanned the shop. "How will you survive?" was what she wanted to ask. "How will you feed your daughter? How will you reopen?" All that hung in the air with the fog of flour and sugar. "Just lately I've delivered messages for the telegraph office, as you have seen, only very early and late, when we were closed, but that work only isn't enough." Carrie followed Ling's gaze to the window. The word "closed" seemed to rebound off the points of glass that no longer kept any boundaries between open or not. They didn't even take any of it to use. She heard her own words for what they were, partly compassionate, but also, God help her, she was thinking of Tully and Jersey, with little on their stomachs all day, and a floor here full of food. Oats and cinnamon, and platters of round white pastries like full moons, all frosted now with glass slivers and shards, all of it inedible. John Cabot knelt to gather the larger shards of glass into a tin pail. For a moment, that was the only sound in the shop, the plink, plink, plink of the ruined window. Crossing the floor, Carrie reached for a broom. Homemade, she noticed, as her people made brooms, a birch limb for its handle and a wide skirt of stiff straw and corn husks tied off at a tight waist of twine. Carrie began sweeping. The twins stood gawking at the ransacked shop, but when they met Carrie's eyes, her look sent them scurrying to find little pails and straw baskets to begin picking up trash and more of the larger chunks of broken glass. Clomping her way again through a rubble, Jeanne joined the twins in their work. A mashed pastry here with a footprint in its moon face, the cracked head of a doll there, her soft, velvet-clad body slashed open. Tully's eyes on the doll, she was biting her lip as she swept, Carrie saw, biting it harder and sweeping more violently to keep back the tears. Carrie lifted the pastry with a footprint and studied the indentation. Soft edges with the slightest suggestion of stitching, and a toe with a perfectly rounded symmetry, no right or left shoe. So a handmade boot, a local man, or at the very least, someone wearing a mountain man's shoes. Carrie bent for a sheet of soiled blank paper, turned it over, but the other side was not blank. Here was the flyer again, the one with the 4 caricatures and the warning. As Ling approached, she let go as suddenly as if Mr. Edison's electrical currents jolted through it. With maddening slowness, the paper wafted to the floor and landed, printed side up. Ling gestured toward it with his head. "I've seen this already, around town." "L-N-A," Carrie murmured, not meaning to say it aloud. Drops of blood appeared on the flyer at her feet. Cabot was crouching over it, reading its message. His lips moved, forming the letters L-N-A.
I wonder, Ligue Nationale. He hadn't seemed to have noticed that several fingers of his right hand were sliced open. Reaching for the doll with a smashed porcelain face, Carrie whipped out the knife she kept in her boot and separated the doll's skirt from its lacerated body. Running the knife down the skirt's muslin, she knelt with the fabric next to Cabot. Taking his right hand, she pressed the bleeding fingers so that they bled more. After giving the muslin another shake to rid it of any slivers of porcelain or wood, she bandaged the hand. It still needs a good cleaning when you get back, but this'll keep it from bleeding onto your shirt. Cabot lifted his eyes to hers. Thank you. You bandage well. Milkmaids, she returned, have many gifts. Cabot blinked, startled. But before he could respond, Carrie pointed to the flyer. You recognize the letters L-N-A? Cabot reached with his bandaged hand for the paper. When I was in Paris several years ago, back before... That expression flashed again over his face, the one Carrie had read as anger and arrogance, but maybe was closer to pain he was trying to cover. Some friends and I were briefly the guests of the Rothschild family who lived there. Carrie had heard the name in New York, something to do with banking or with social glamour, or both. The Rothschilds and the larger Jewish community in Paris were being harassed in a number of ways by what I gathered was a fairly newly formed group. It was led by a nationalist named Edouard Drumont, who organized riots, pogroms, propaganda of all sorts. They called themselves the Ligue Nationale Antisémitique de France. Carrie touched one finger to the flyer. L-N-A. Yes, although why we'd see this here. She hesitated, weighing how much she could trust him. Perhaps you should know, a member of your own party at Biltmore received a telegram with those initials, L-N-A, on it. Grant. She nodded, not missing how quickly he'd known which Biltmore guest it must be. It mentioned gaining strength among the educated. That fits with the LNA. It's taken root in certain corners of the upper crust. But why would Grant be connected to a group in France? Views like the LNA promotes have been showing up in similar ways here, at Harvard, Yale, Stanford, in private clubs. People push back at what they see changing. You must have seen it for yourself in New York. Walking down the streets of our cities these days is like taking a trip around the world. Carrie picked through glass for anything that could be saved. The languages, the smells, the foods, the sounds of the prayers even. And that frightens some people. Some people react like this. With his head, he gestured toward the shattered window. Now he held up the flyer, or by trying to make others scared. Carrie rose and began sweeping again with big, angry stabs. Ling came to stand in front of her, placed a hand on her broom's end to stop its movement, but gently, like a man who disliked force of any kind, even just the stilling of a broom handle. Carrie looked up. Ling turned from her to Cabot, to the twins, both picking up shards. Jeanne and I, we thank you. Jersey straightened, puffing his chest. We don't take kindly to bullies. Most especially, Tully added, tossing her head toward the ochre paint, ones who can't spell. One corner of John Cabot's mouth turned up in a sad smile. His eyes swung to meet Carrie's and stayed there. A shiver ran the length of her spine. Chapter 26. Lily Barthelемy's hands never trembled, but they shook now as she grasped the envelope. Ducking into Biltmore's empty breakfast room and closing its doors, she drew a breath, long and deep, to steady her nerves. A platter of cheeses, brie, gorgonzola, gruyere, and roquefort, in a lovely crescent, had been set out with fruit on the sideboard alongside Madeira. Her stomach nodded.
Absurdly, she pictured her insides in the half-hitches the stable hand Bergamini had used to secure the mare she'd been riding this morning. She'd stayed in the stables for a while again after her ride to chat with him as he'd worked. He'd talked with her too, longer this time even than the last, but made a point of not standing still, and rarely meeting her eye, except for one moment. One telling moment when she'd reached for his sketch, propped next to a finishing brush, at the same moment he did. He'd turned fully to face her. She'd frightened herself at that moment, because she'd meant only to flirt just enough to blur his thinking, take the sharp edge off whatever anger he might feel toward her, because she came from New Orleans and her father was rich, and the Italians from there might resent her sort of family. But she was supposed to be in control of how all this went. Standing there facing him this morning and holding his sketch of a house, she did not feel in control. Mon Dieu, she berated herself, a Sicilienne for God's sake, threatening to turn the tables on her. The black curly hair and the dark eyes and the sweat that dampened the span of his chest. His sweet tenderness with his brother one moment, his gentleness with the horses, and then, moments later, something wild and unshackled as he looked at her, her breath coming ragged and her plans blurred. Merde, stay focused, Lily. Nothing good could come from her thinking like this about the Sicilian. Hadn't she already taken too much of a risk by talking with him several times now in the stables, by standing too close? Bon Dieu, Lily, stop it! The man was not part of her world, could never be. If the newspapers had had their way, her father's name would have been linked with the riots and lynchings, though he'd never left his offices on the wharves. Still, reporters had been waiting for him outside their home. Though clearly, mon père, she'd said to him the next morning, the streets of New Orleans still wet with blood, you are not to blame. He'd patted her on the head as if she'd been a child, though she'd been 14 at the time. A strong man never lets the press push him around, he'd said, which hadn't exactly answered the question she'd never quite asked. Nothing about the Barthélemy family in connection with the lynchings ever surfaced in print, which her 14-year-old self had taken as proof her father could not be guilty. She'd kept believing that in the years since, even in the wake of the occasional nightmare when she relived that horrible night, she'd still believed it when he cabled to suggest she meet him a week early in Asheville, believed that he was traveling there just to see his daughter and breathe the fresh air. Until the telegram arrived at Battery Park from one of his underlings, apparently, letting him know the New York Times had dispatched a reporter not only to New Orleans, but also, having learned where he was, to Asheville. Even then, when she'd learned he'd fled without saying goodbye, even when she'd made arrangements to defend their family name, she'd still believed in the innocence of her father, a man unfairly maligned. She scowled at herself in the looking-glass and was startled to see how quickly her lovely features could look almost homely, contorted like that. Reason enough not to scowl. Running a finger over the waving lines of the inked flag that canceled the postage and the envelope's edge, Lily squinted at where, in her hurry, she'd mutilated the paper in ripping it open. Back home in New Orleans, her father would have reprimanded her for being so common, not using the sterling letter opener the butler would have brought her. Brinkley, her father called a New Orleans butler, though his name was Tom Brown, the son of enslaved people. But Lily's father believed in the power of image and the power of name, and the power of power itself. Their banker had advised that economizing, including releasing the butler, might be prudent in the wake of the crash of '93, and, he'd added delicately, also after the unpleasantness. The banker avoided the words inquest or investigation or Barthélemy shipping, following all that foreign unrest in New Orleans in '91. Lily had heard her father fume,
Barthelemy always have butlers.
Regardless of financial teeterings, and regardless of Lily and her mother departing for New York, Brinkley the butler remained with Lily's father at the New Orleans mansion, probably not even a cook left by now. Lily eased out the paper folded inside the ragged envelope. She forced herself to read the barely legible hand again. We got to talk. Soon. Once more, with only that handful of words, Lily could hardly breathe. What if she'd made the thing worse by refusing even to acknowledge his note? She'd seen the rage building in him, ready to blow. Still, he'd been the one to botch the job. It was his fault she lay awake nights now and heard train whistles and a man's cries for help. His fault. Merde. Lily crumpled the letter and hurled it across the room. The door flung open before Lily even heard footsteps, Emily sweeping into the room. She changed out of her walking dress and into a green watered silk gown with sequined butterflies taking flight as the skirt swished. "The House of Worth," Lily blurted. The first distraction she'd thought of. The designer in Paris where Emily had probably bought it, and always a safe subject. But one of Emily's feet landed next to the crushed note, far too close for comfort.
Who in heaven's name do you have hidden in here with you, Lil? I heard you say something before I came in.
Lily swept her hand across the span of the room. It's quite free of conspirators, as you see, unless someone is hiding just there outside the glass. She gestured toward the windows with their sweeping view of the deer park. If only Emily would cross the room now to look out at the view. Instead, Emily made a show of checking both ways. No handsome dukes? No renegade blackguards pining for your affections? She turned, the letter crunching under the toe of her satin slipper. Lily forced herself to appear calm. Casually, she reached down for the letter. Emily pounced on it. Voila! A note from a secret admirer. Now Lily dove for it, but Emily snatched it up before her friend could touch it.
Oh no, as your closest confidant, I have every right to know what kept you pacing at night last week, and to whom just now you were directing that French fury of yours.
Emily spun away, right hand overhead clutching the letter. Gazing up, she wrinkled her nose at the handwriting.
How very atrocious. Of all the men of our acquaintance, I can't say I know a single one with such an indecipherable hand.
Desperate, Lily leapt upward, sent her friend tumbling back against the wall. Emmy Vanderbilt Sloane sank against the hand-tooled leather wallpaper and all the way down to the floor, her expression its own complex design of bewilderment and surprise. For a moment, the two friends stared at each other. At this rate, I'll be not only at the center of a cyclone of scandal, I'll be fist-fighting those who would get in my way. Lily held out her hand. Forgive me, please. Ignoring the offer of help, Emily slapped the letter in Lily's palm, then rose from the floor, brushing past to walk to the window. She spoke with a coldness Lily had rarely heard from her. I won't pry further into your private affairs. Lily shook her head. I'm sorry, I never was comfortable in school days either, with the other girls knowing my latest crush. Better to have Emily assume she was being denied intimate details of Lily's romantic interests than have her suspect Lily's real connection with the writer of this letter. Lily forced her head to dip, a kind of embarrassed gesture that felt deeply unnatural. The handwriting, as you say, is not that of an educated man. Emily twisted the rest of the way around from where she stood, arms crossed. Already her face was softening. Am I to understand, then, that this secret admirer of yours is not a gentleman of our set? Lily allowed herself to blush, and as her thoughts flashed to the stables, her blush deepened. Why, Lils, I do believe you have an admirer of a more, what shall we call it, plebeian sort. But that sounds unromantic. My, how risky and thrilling. Apparently forgetting the letter, which Lily crumpled behind her back, Emily swished across the room. Let me guess now.
Had I not seen the penmanship for myself, I'd have presumed any clandestine messages coming to you these days would be from my Uncle George. Although my dear uncle lacks the bravado with women, bless him, to send you a secret note this early in your acquaintance. Or Mr. Madison Grant. Ah, a flicker of recognition here. Well then, someone to keep an eye on at least. Or from Mr. Cabot. One finger tapping her lips, Emily circled her friend like a detective haranguing a suspect. Still, we have the problem of the unschooled hand, the atrocious penmanship, which could hardly belong to any of these gentlemen. Lily forced a girlish smile as her friend's inquisition went on. And now we see another flush on your cheeks. Really, Lils, the possibilities of liaisons are endless with you. I know. The desk clerk back at Battery Park. He makes eyes at you each time we pass and finds every excuse to call you aside. Holding her breath, Lily batted her eyes the way she imagined other women did when they felt flustered, the heat of panic deep in her gut she let rise to her face. But no, that won't do. He would write in a smoother hand, I feel sure. Any man who speaks English, French, and Italian as he does. Emily stopped there, whipped and about face. Italian! My Uncle George's Italian? The new stable hand? Lily turned away. This was bad, awful even, but much better than having Emily stumble toward a far more dangerous truth. Emily sat down heavily. The Italian. When Lily turned, she found her friend no longer with the impish smile she'd worn only a moment ago. The expression she wore now was disbelieving, confused, and vaguely, what was it? Lily realized with a jolt what she was seeing on her friend's darkened face, and now it was too late to undo the lie she'd let cover the truth. Disapproval, thunderous and fierce. Emily thought she'd uncovered Lily's liaison with the Italian, a murder suspect no less, and, still more disturbing than that, a groom. Flirtations were one thing, but Lily Barthélemy always took things almost too far. And this time, Emily's face set for her, Lily had driven the bounds of proper behavior right over the edge. Chapter 27. Balancing a tray of biscuits and scones, Carrie stopped at the threshold of the breakfast room as George Vanderbilt's niece stalked away from her friend, the women clearly having argued bitterly over something. The door still only open a crack, Carrie hesitated, unsure whether to pretend she'd not seen. It was the footman who saved her the trouble of deciding, Moncrief's brogue spiraling down the grand stairwell. From 4 stories up, he called, "Where's the wee American lass of the fells?" Backtracking hurriedly down the servants' corridor, running behind the breakfast room and banquet hall, and dropping her tray on a hall table, Carrie raced to the foot of the grand stairwell before anyone might complain of the noise. Mrs. Smythe appeared on the second-floor landing. "I'll not be having my staff yelling like a bevied up." She deepened the ferocity of her glare upward. "Like a drunk clan of Scots," she was about to say. "Did you see?" Making way for 3 painters bumbling past, Mrs. Smythe shook a thick finger up at Moncrief. "As if it isn't enough, whole regiments of workmen tromping past us all day, the service stairs still a proper mess of sawdust, all these workers and the servants having to use the main staircase with Mr. Vanderbilt and the guests. Only in the colonies would this be allowed." Carrie looked up with sympathy. "You're doing your best to retain standards, Mrs. Smythe. This, and the master still being in want of a wife to take charge." Mrs. Smythe shook her head. "Aye, but he won't be for long, God love him." Moncrief's Glasgow burr was amplified by the stone. Mrs. Smythe threw up her hands, then drew a finger over her lips. "Begone with you before I ban your ruddy face from the house, and no more shouting." Her mouth puckered with the effort of finding the right expletive for him. "Scotsman," she spit at last, and stormed off.
3 floors away, Carrie and the footman exchanged glances that said they both knew Mrs. Smythe was the loudest voice of all echoing in the stairwell. Moncrief winked. George Vanderbilt and Cedric came loping in from outside, the front door slamming behind them with a force that echoed across the main hall. John Cabot rose from where he'd apparently been reading in the winter garden. Madison Grant appeared at the door that led to the billiard room. From the breakfast room, Lily Barthélemy suddenly appeared, hurrying down into the winter garden from its far side. She thrust a scrap of paper into her skirt's waistband. "Ah!" George Vanderbilt strode toward Carrie, who'd just picked up her tray from the hall table. "Splendid idea to serve tea in the winter garden on a wet November day." Stepping down into the glass-domed room, Carrie arranged the sterling pieces on a table near the fountain, the tea and cream and sugar beside mounded pastries on the left and buttermilk biscuits on the right, Pierre and Rima drawing their battle lines even on this platter. Lily Barthélemy lifted a chocolate croissant from her plate, its fragrance wafting toward Carrie, who, with effort, did not let her eyes drop ravenously to the platter. "Goodness, how I'll miss Biltmore." Lifting his teacup in a kind of toast, Vanderbilt said, "Then you must return to Biltmore, all of you, in the new year." Lily Barthélemy placed her hand on her chest. "How lovely!" She moved to admire an etching that hung at eye level. As Carrie swept past, the woman raised her tea almost to her lips and tipped it, tea splashing down her front, without Carrie's having touched her. "Comme c'est triste," she said, running a hand across the satin. Vanderbilt was quick to turn. "I'm so sorry. Was there an accident?" With an excess of graciousness, she smiled at Carrie. "Don't blame her, please. It could have happened to anyone. An unintentional jostle was all. We'll just step through here and repair the damage." Before Carrie could protest she'd not touched Mr. Vanderbilt's guest, she was being pulled into the corridor, the door closing behind them. Lily Barthélemy plucked the scrap of paper from her waistband. "I wonder if I might ask you about something." Carrie took a breath, but didn't let it out yet. With the breath might come all sorts of words that could end this job. Her way of supporting the twins. Her eyes dropped to the woman's skirts. "Your dress appears as if it will weather the damage I didn't do to it." Lily Barthélemy raised an eyebrow. "You're a cheeky one, aren't you?" "If by cheeky you mean straightforward, then I shall be straightforward in return. Perhaps you'd like to elucidate why you blanched the other day when you saw a letter delivered to me." Carrie paused, sifting out what she could say, like separating turnips from the weeds they were yanked up with. "It reminded me of the handwriting of an old friend." Lily Barthélemy took her measure. "And it startled me. What I mean is, what did you make of it?" Carrie returned the steadiness of her look. "You might imagine why I'd hesitate to say more." Lily Barthélemy crossed her arms and appeared to consider how to proceed. "If, by chance, the handwriting you saw was indeed that of an old friend of yours, which would be rather extraordinary, of course, I would ask you this. Can he be trusted?" There was a time I'd have said yes without hesitation. And now there are things about him I don't recognize as the same man. "I see. Let us be honest, then, as one woman to another who knows what it is to have men pursue them." Carrie said nothing, waiting. "I'm well aware our stations in life are different, but let me be blunt. Your looks are striking, and you are surprisingly well-spoken for a mountain sot." "Surprisingly?" Lily Barthélemy was plowing on. "You no doubt know what it is to receive unasked for, and often unwanted, attentions from men you hardly know. Come now." Carrie only tipped her head. "At any rate, I would ask that you say nothing to any one of these letters." The woman stopped there,
As if realizing too late she'd used the plural, she stepped closer. "I can assure you the arrival of these has been loathsome to me." "That I can see." Lily Barthélemy looked frustrated with their exchange. She frowned. "You may depart." Instead of a curtsy, Carrie managed only a nod and strode down the servants' passageway. With a St. Bernard trotting close by her side, Carrie darted toward the library. She wouldn't have long before she'd be noticed missing. On top of a half-unpacked crate, she ran her fingers over the first editions, Dickens and Austen and Eliot. But she had little time. Before seeing Ling's shop, she might have convinced herself that Grant's mention in his telegram of a bald eagle and a certain sort of rooster, and whatever the German word meant, were simply allusions to birds in danger of extinction, or maybe species he meant to secure for his new job, the Bronx Zoo. All the servants who'd served a meal or afternoon tea, or even collected coats for George Vanderbilt's visitors, had overheard plenty about Grant's wildlife preservation. But the flyer covered in glass on the floor of Ling's ruined shop was related to or produced by the LNA, the group cited in Grant's cable. So the telegram must have been referencing something far more sinister than avian extinction. Carrie pulled down a stack of bound Atlantic monthly collections she'd cleaned and shelved. Miss Hobson had subscribed to the magazine. A photograph in time, she'd like to say, of American intellectual culture. The fact that Vanderbilt viewed them as worthy of keeping and binding by year in fine leather underscored this. Surely, then, if any periodical might hold a clue to the views Madison Grant and his sort were spreading. Heart-racing, she flipped through one at a time, scanning for mentions of the Ligue Nationale Antisémitique or anything else that even remotely might fit with the letters LNA. She could have asked John Cabot what he made of the mention of the bald eagle or the rooster in Grant's telegram, but somehow she wanted to trust herself first to find some sort of clue. One after another, she scanned commentaries on Grover Cleveland, on the overcrowding of American cities, teeming sewers and filthy streets, on the poverty of tenement housing, on the robber barons and their opulent homes. The Vanderbilt name came up often, the railroads they owned, the mansions in Newport and New York, a few mentions even of Biltmore. One article addressed a growing distrust in Europe and the United States of Jews and immigrants. Carrie scanned it quickly, her eye caught by images of national pride in England, the Barbary lion, the rose, St. George's Cross, Germany, a coat of arms with a black eagle, and also France, the fleur-de-lis, among others. None of the articles mentioned the Ligue Nationale Antisémitique in particular. Several, however, alluded to a nationalist fervor growing not just in the United States, but around the world. Carrie raced to finish flipping through the recent editions. Still nothing specifically about LNA. And now she could hear voices as several guests passed through the main hall toward the grand staircase, which would mean they'd be changing for dinner, and that she'd be needed in the butler's pantry quite soon. The bookmark was still jutting out of the edition of American Architecture. Carrie stepped quickly for the volume, let it fall open to the article. Though it was Grant who seemed most clearly linked to the flyers, and the person she most wanted to find connected somehow to the attack, it seemed only wise to learn what she could of John Cabot, before she convinced herself he could not be involved just because her breath came tight and hitched when he was present. She scanned down the lines, gathering quickly that the Lewisburg Square townhouse on Beacon Hill had been owned by the Cabot family, a branch of John Quincy Adams' descendants. The article detailed the crown molding, brilliantly polished floors fixed with wooden pegs, the inlaid marble and mahogany paneling.
One of the photographs showed a sterling tea set handcrafted by the silversmith Paul Revere, who had become better known for a midnight ride through Lexington and Concord. Another showed a parlor which had been painted. The caption gushed, "A bright yellow gold," the exact color chosen for them by family friend Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose clapboard home in Cambridge was the same shade. John Quincy Cabot might as well have been from another planet entirely than the one where Carrie had begun life. A man like that must be accustomed to letting no one get in his way. In love with the same woman as Berkowitz, Madison Grant had said. Blue-blooded, perhaps cold-blooded too, though Cabot's efforts in Ling Yong's ruined shop made that more complicated to believe now. Carrie skimmed the pages again, a catalogue of riches and privilege. She slammed the volume with more vigor than she meant to, and was just popping it back into place when a door shut on the library's upper floor. Spinning around, she found Vanderbilt, dressed in white tie for dinner, appearing from behind the chimney on the second-floor balcony. "Ah," she began. "Shouldn't have been reading your books," was the only way that sentence could end, "and had no idea there was a door behind the chimney." As if reading her mind, he gestured back with his head. "One of my favorite features of Hunt's. I can slip from my future bedroom and be in my favorite room in seconds without running into the staff." Blushing, he added, "That is, there are times I'd rather not discuss the evening's menu with the excellent Mrs. Smythe until I've read for a bit in the morning. I understand." What an unimaginable luxury, she'd like to have added, to read first thing in the morning, no bell ringing for you, no children hungry, no fires to lay. Hurrying down the staircase that spiraled from the balcony down to the first floor, he approached. "You were reading the article I mentioned about Cabot's home." Nothing to do but nod. "I'm glad you did. But that article doesn't address what happened later, the compassion we should feel for him." Compassion? It wasn't a word that came to mind after seeing the American Architect pictures. "I actually met him in Maine that very summer that this article appeared. He was working a good deal with Jacob Riis." He must have seen no spark of recognition from her. "He wrote the book, How the Other Half Lives, widely discussed." "I'm afraid it's not so widely discussed in my world." To his credit, he flushed. "It focuses on poverty in the tenements of New York." "And now," Carrie offered, "Mr. Cabot is researching poverty in the Southern Appalachians, for his own book, perhaps." George Vanderbilt gave her a slow smile. "You may not be surprised that I was drawn to Mr. Cabot. A man like myself, raised in wealth, but pulled." He glanced to the fire and back to her, "to see how we might address the problems of the poor." The poor. Carrie felt the slap of the label. Her people, her world. But there it was. Vanderbilt's face was pinched with concentration. However awkwardly, he was trying to speak from his heart, from across the chasm between them. "So John Cabot and I had already connected over our mutual interests in philanthropy, addressing poverty with action." He gestured toward the American Architect volume. "One can't help but admire the dignity with which Cabot conducts himself, given everything." From what she'd seen in those pages, Carrie was having trouble imagining why John Quincy Cabot would have trouble conducting himself with dignity. He'd grown up a prince of Beacon Hill, Boston, vacationed with Vanderbilts, probably never lost so much as a game of jacks in his life. With a sudden glance at a clock above the mantel, Vanderbilt turned. "But I'm forgetting the time. I should rejoin my guests. A conversation for another time, then." He disappeared out the doors to the bowling green, Cedric at his heels. Alone in the library now, Carrie tipped her head back to stare at the ceiling. The Pellegrini painting had been mounted at its outer sections and several of the inner, the rest still to be affixed. Maybe her initial impressions of John Cabot as cold and arrogant had been wrong. She could be impulsive that way with her judgments. Maybe she'd positioned the pieces she'd seen of him into something that perhaps wasn't the full picture. Still, though, he was a man who knew nothing of life as she lived it, struggle and loss and long, grueling hours of work, all while looking for reasons to laugh with her siblings and not show the worry that gnawed every day at her insides. Mrs. Smythe poked her head into the library. "Ah, Carrie, there you are, still unpacking the books, I see. We'll be at that for some time. Nip up to the observatory and over to the billiard room to collect the bevies the guests have left about. It's been enough brandy flowing today to float an ark, it would. Then report to the butler's pantry." Carrie wound her way up the grand staircase and then, farther, up a small spiral staircase to Vanderbilt's observatory at the very top of the house, where the owner of the house or a random guest could often be found alone, thinking, reading, far above the hustle and hurry of the rest of the mansion still under construction. The observatory was empty just now, only a cold mountain wind howling through a window someone had left open. Stepping to it, Carrie leaned out to peer down and felt the ground 4 stories down spin. Hauling it closed, Carrie staggered back away from her own vertigo. Such a long fall. She'd not be coming up here again if she could help it. Without looking out at the view, Carrie spun through the room collecting glasses on a tray. Her footsteps shushing on the staircase as she ran, Carrie dropped back down to the main hall, across the winter garden to the billiard room. Glancing quickly around, she found it quiet and in good order except for 2 more glasses, which she added to the tray. Sumptuously paneled, the room was viciously cold despite a fire in the fireplace. Just as footsteps approached from the hallway, Carrie spotted something glowing orange in the grate. Stepping quickly to the hearth, she plucked with her bare hand at the part of the cloth not already consumed. White cotton, a sleeve, like a man's shirt. As the whole shirt shifted toward her, the other sleeve fully on fire now, Carrie spotted a stripe of something down the sleeve. Something like paint. Paint that was ochre in color. The color of those words, sickly and still dripping on the remains of Ling's shop windows, which meant that this was either John Cabot's shirt or it belonged to someone else who'd been at the scene before. Someone, perhaps, like Madison Grant. And now the doorknob was turning. Chapter 28. Carrie might have tossed the flaming shirt back into the fire before Madison Grant had fully swung the door open, but she surely didn't smooth her expression in time. His gaze flicked to the fireplace, then stayed on her. "Well, I'm a fortunate man to find you alone." He ambled toward her, extended a hand as she stepped back. With a jangle of the key ring at her waist, Mrs. Smythe bustled to the doorway. "Carrie, dear." She stopped when she spotted Grant. Her voice tightened. "Excuse me, sir, but we're needing the staff downstairs." The rebuke in her tone might have made another gentleman blush, but Grant only smiled cloyingly at the housekeeper. "Naturally." Hurrying past him, Carrie did not meet his eye. All throughout dinner, as the sterling clattered and the string quartet played, Grant squinted toward the doors of the butler's pantry at the far end of the banquet hall, watching for Carrie. It appeared. Unloading platters from the dumbwaiters to give the footmen, Carrie could see him repeatedly turning to stare each time the servant's entrance swung open, but she could mostly dodge out of his line of sight. For once, she was grateful for her place at the bottom of the social hierarchy of Biltmore. It kept her walled off tonight, quite literally, from the advances and demands of these people who made as many outfit changes over a single day as they had courses at dinner. It kept her cordoned off, too, tonight from her own swirl of emotions, all the questions she'd not yet managed to answer about who could be trusted and who couldn't. As the pantry door swung open and closed, she caught glimpses of the diamonds winking, the starch of the men's winged collars, the women's long strands of pearls. The conversation rolled through the door's crack in snatches, snippets of travel observations, bits of flirtation, shreds of questions about Biltmore's forest. "It's the acoustics of our banquet hall at Biltmore," Mrs. Smythe had said while they'd set the table, as proudly as if she'd designed the house herself. "They allow for a person to whisper at one end of the table and be heard at the opposite end. Remarkable, that." Which would explain all the diners stopping at several points through the long dinner to listen to Madison Grant. "The pronghorn," he said at one point, "is actually an artiodactyl mammal, not an antelope, although it is often referred to as one colloquially. We at the Boone and Crockett Club have determined the pronghorn is facing annihilation. It falls to us to protect them and their habitat. Without intervention, they'll not only cease to thrive, they will cease to be." Later, it was Grant's voice again, audible over the others. "Their sort flooding in from Eastern Europe, from Russia. So restricting their immigration is key. The diseases alone they bring threaten the..." The electric and manual dumbwaiters hummed and rattled as Carrie loaded the dishes of Rima's muscadine cobbler topped with Pierre's cream onto silver platters. But all evening she kept hearing Grant's words from that night at the station and that day on the loggia. "Another newspaper man who is a Jew. Extraordinary, wouldn't you say? Annihilation. Breeding." The words from those moments and this provided the rhythm of her night as she scrubbed pots after dinner and walked home through the dark. Extraordinary, wouldn't you say? Invasion, disease, annihilation. Extraordinary. As if by extraordinary Grant meant disturbing, as if Grant himself would have liked to see Berkowitz put in his place. Or perhaps put out of the way entirely, where Madison Grant's reputation would be safe from whatever the reporter might have known about him. The next morning, Mrs. Smythe gestured for Carrie to join the other servants outdoors. "It's a poor show as the flimsy goodbye a guest is given in America, even from a great house. Back home, every servant of rank lines up proper, as it should be." Carrie took her place outside the front doors, facing the esplanade. Dusting off his top hat, Madison Grant was walking backward. "One last view of your magnificent hall, Vanderbilt. I shall look forward." Bumping into Carrie, he turned and gave a slight bow. "To returning quite soon." He looked meaningfully into her eyes. Emily Sloane smiled at Carrie as she and her friend passed, both elegant in dresses whose waists pulled in tight and plunged to a sharp V. The feathers of their hats brushed together as Emily tipped her head to say something, her eyes shooting toward where a stable hand was holding the team. But Marco Bergamini's gaze had fixed upon Lily Barthelemy. Even in this frigid November air, his shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, his arms muscled and hairy, and strangely tensed, like he was concentrating on not moving. Lily Barthelemy, though, appeared not to notice the stare focused on her. Carrie would not let herself look around for John Cabot. Grant, his trunks from Battery Park already loaded, stood chatting with his host. "I do hope, George, there's more progress forthcoming on the attack." Together they walked to the carriage's far side. "It's sad this," Mrs. Smythe sighed. "All the guests leaving. The only excitement now will be keeping the footmen smoking outside rather than in." "All the guests," she'd said. Inside the carriage, the ladies adjusted their satins and silks. No one else burst from the house as a last-minute addition. So John Cabot was evidently leaving too, without so much as a word of goodbye. Not that he owed Carrie a thing. They'd only shared a few hours of cleaning up a vandalized shop. That hardly made them intimate friends, and hardly answered all her questions about him. Carrie kept her hands clasped in front of her waist. She would work her fingers to the bone in cleaning whatever Mrs. Smythe suggested. She would go home and be up much of the night, taking back over for the twins in caring for their father. By dawn, she would be done with all thoughts of John Cabot. Marco Bergamini, his jaw set square, climbed onto the driver's box and snapped the reins to the team. A matched set of bays, they pulled out in perfectly synchronized steps. Coats gleaming in the early morning sun, they looked not even remotely kin to the horses that roamed free through the hollows and hills. The carriage rolled away on the right side of the esplanade. Oddly, Vanderbilt was no longer standing at the far side of the carriage. From behind Carrie came the scent of pine. George mentioned it's nearly time to cut wreaths for the doors, and to hang around the necks of the two marble lines here. Carrie turned to find John Cabot standing there, a fur wreath slung over one arm. He insisted when he returns from seeing his guests off at the station, he and I will try our hands at the task. Carrie made her eyes leave his and fix on the mountains. I'd have thought you'd have left with the others. That had been my plan, yes, but I had nowhere to go for the holidays, and George was gracious enough to offer my staying on. In love with the same woman as the reporter, a voice in her head warned her. Maybe just words from an unreliable source. Still, there were too many things unanswered about John Cabot, and too great a divide between them. Every reason to keep her impulsive nature in check. I'm glad, for you I mean, to stay on. Carrie turned quickly away and slipped through the front doors. From the back stairs that led down to the kitchens, someone was shouting her name at the top of his lungs with a thick Scottish brogue. Stumbling and crashing over the lumber stacked in the service stairwell, Moncrief burst up from it. Carrie, lass, it's news. I'm so sorry. It's... My father. Her head swam. No, I'm sorry, not that. I dinna ken what I was thinking to scare you. It's your house, I'm meaning. Your brother's come with the news. Nobody's hurt, but the roof, it's fallen in. Chapter 29. Carrie and the twins worked all the rest of the day and most of the night. The roof had collapsed between the wood stove and the one bed where their father lay, unconscious at least through it all. Please, Carrie had asked Moncrief and Mrs. Smythe before she'd left, don't mention to anyone about the roof. Because if John Cabot, or for that matter, George Vanderbilt or the others knew and wanted to help, she'd be mortified for them to see it, the collapsed roof and the cabin itself. Or if they knew and did nothing, she'd rather not know that either. And to the twins she said, none of us will tell the Bratchett's about this while we're still fixing it here. We're already so beholden to them. The roof was far beyond patching or buttressing now, the weight of the snow and ice on its rotted shingles and beams, too much at last. Snow lay in bright mounds on the churn, on the rocking chair her father had made for her mother before the twins' birth, on the foot of their father's bed. They bundled the sick man in quilts and carried him on a wool blanket serving a stretcher out to the barn. Romeo lumbered beside his master and slid himself into a full-bodied sprawl, again at Johnny Mac's feet in the barn. Carrie and Jersey hauled out the wood stove and cut a hole in a wall for its chimney pipe. Not that all the cracks between boards won't let out the smoke, and let in all the winter cold. They restuffed the tick with dry pine needles they dug out from under the ice and settled their father on it.
The sweetest he smelled for a long spell, Jersey pronounced. They salvaged what they could, the school books first, blessedly unharmed in stacks along a far wall, and then the table and the 3 chairs and the cast-iron griddle, and last but not least, the fiddle, the singing bow, and the 2 newly crafted banjos from their hooks on the wall.
This is the end of disc number 6. Please insert disc number 7.